ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More information at expressvpn.com/Tom.
We say fight back!
Book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America by Carol Anderson. This is from the introduction. It was like a snuff film, that July 6th, 2016 live stream. Philando Castile sat in his car, buckled in, bleeding, dying. "Why did you shoot him, sir?" asked his fiancée, Diamond Reynolds, pain piercing her every word. Castile, who had been pulled over in a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, because his quote, wide-set nose, end quote, supposedly resembled that of a robbery suspect, had been reaching for his ID, but in order to avoid any surprises, let the police officer know he had a gun with him, a legally permitted, right-to-carry concealed gun. That was all the cop needed to know. Officer Geronimo Yanez began shooting. Castile's death came just one day after Alton Sterling's down in Louisiana. He, too, was carrying a gun, which was not unusual in this right-to-carry state. Granted, Sterling had a felony conviction, so owning a firearm was, for him, illegal, but he had been robbed before and wanted protection. On July 5th, 2016, the Baton Rouge police received a 911 call that there was a man with a weapon threatening customers at a local convenience store. As officers rolled onto the scene, they saw Sterling sitting there, selling CDs and DVDs, just as the store owner allowed him to do and indeed welcomed. The threatening man was not Sterling. In fact, there was no threatening man. It had been a prank call, but that didn't matter. Within a few minutes, police had thrown the black man down, pinned him to the asphalt, and then started yelling that Sterling had a gun. He did. It was in his pocket where he could hardly reach it, what with the officers squatting on both his legs and one arm. Nevertheless, the police began firing round after round into his prone body, point blank. Blood poured out of his chest. But not for long. Alton Sterling was dead. The back-to-back deaths of these two black men police had shot for carrying guns should have jolted into action the Second Amendment's staunchest advocate, the National Rifle Association. In 1995, for example, the organization's denunciations flew fast and furious when it contended that law enforcement not only overreacted, but went out of its way to kill gun owners. Angered by the deaths at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, and the siege and firefight at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, both of which were sparked by federal agents serving warrants for weapons violations, Wayne LaPierre, the NRA's executive vice president, angrily wrote, quote, "If you have a badge, you have the government's go-ahead to harass, intimidate, and even murder law-abiding citizens," end quote. He further denounced cops as, quote, "jackbooted government thugs who have more power to take away our constitutional rights, break in our doors, seize our guns, destroy our property, and even injure or kill us." Nearly 2 decades later, that sentiment had not changed. This was evident when Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, who had refused to pay over $1 million in fees for grazing his cattle on public land, summoned his gun-toting, self-styled militiamen to do battle with federal authorities to prevent the seizure of his herd for restitution. Richard Mack, a former recipient of the NRA's Law Enforcement Officer of the Year award, asserted, "If federal agents are going to start killing people, I'm sorry, but to show the world how ruthless these people are, women and children need to be placed in the front lines as human shields." Mack didn't flinch as he insisted, quote, "Women need to be the first ones shot. I would have put my own wife or daughter there on the front lines, and I would have been a screaming bloody murder to watch them die," end quote. Larry Pratt, a speaker at the NRA's 2014 National Convention, commenting on the fact that Bundy, quote, backed them, the Bureau of Land Management agents, down with automatic rifles and other deadly weaponry, proudly called that armed confrontation, quote, a proper, legitimate, lawful response to illegitimate, unlawful exercise of government power, particularly on the federal level, end quote. Yet how quickly the NRA's swagger disappeared when government agents gunned down Philando Castile and Alton Sterling for merely carrying guns. Sterling's death didn't even merit acknowledgement. As for Castile, the NRA broke its silence only after inordinate pressure from African-American members led the gun manufacturers' lobby to issue a tepid statement that the Second Amendment was applicable, quote, regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation. When pressed further by many of its members to stand up for Castile, the often fierce organization demurred, saying it was, quote, important for the NRA not to comment while the investigation is ongoing. This situational silence did not go unnoticed. The NRA had not only loudly defended the rights of those at the Branch Davidian cult on Woody Ridge, men who had actually shot and killed members of law enforcement, but
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And happy Wacky Wednesday. Yes, Sean just coined the phrase. Okay, I won't do that again. I apologize. I promise. Excuse me. Welcome to our program today. We've got a lot coming up. Americans begged politicians for peaceful progressive revolution for 40 friggin' years. Will it happen? I'm going to get into that in just a minute. And the three-step fascism plan now in place. I mean, this is pretty spooky stuff. Professor Richard Wolff is going to drop by in our second hour. Are people rejecting the do you want fries with that kind of minimum wage economy? What's going on here? What has, the supply chains and all this stuff and changes in employment and a whole bunch of people leaving their jobs in the last 6 months? Anyhow, we'll get to that in the second hour. And Rebecca Vallas in our second hour will be with us about why the work requirement on the child tax credit is a bad idea. This is the new thing that apparently Sinema and Manchin are pushing. Oh, yeah, you don't give child tax credits unless people are working. John Beard Jr. will be with us in the third hour. Why do we need to declare a climate emergency and stop all new fossil fuel projects? And on this date in history, it was the Battle of Hastings today in 1066 when King Harold II of England was defeated by William, the Duke of Normandy, in the Norman Conquest, which kind of radically altered British history. So anyhow, that's what's up. Let me start out with this, with my rant today from thehartmanreport.com. It's titled, Americans Begged Politicians for Peaceful Progressive Revolution for 40 Years. Will it happen? And I started out with the story. On March 13th, 1962, President John F. Kennedy said, and I quote, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. And here we are. We have armed militias in our streets. We have violence in our state capitals, in our school boards, and on airplanes. And just 10 months ago, we saw an actual attempt at violent revolution in the U.S. Capitol. So what happened to that peaceful revolution? Here's the history. This is just a quick history of the last 40 years. First off, we had 12 years of Reagan-Bush, which completely exhausted Americans. I mean, there were the continual tax cuts on the rich, multiple tax cuts on the rich, pushing all kinds of federal money to the 1%. There was the war on working people that saw the unionization rate in this country drop by more than half. We saw the repeated attacks on the nation's social safety net. Reagan doubled our taxes for Social Security. So it was the largest tax increase on working people in history. One of 18 times that Reagan raised taxes on working class people. And he made Social Security benefits taxable for the first time since the program was put into place in the 1930s. He eliminated the ability of working class people to deduct interest payments on credit cards and car loans, all while cutting taxes on the morbidly rich. He dropped the top tax rate from 74% down to 25%. CEO pay exploded, and because we had no more tax revenue, we stopped building and repairing our infrastructure. For the first time since World War II, working class wages had gone flat, while expenses, particularly for housing, transportation, and healthcare, just exploded. Republican politicians stopped holding town halls and started hanging out with lobbyists. The gutting of the American middle class was underway, and we knew it. This was 1992, 12 years of Reagan and Bush. And so we said, hey, we need something different. How about a peaceful progressive revolution? And along came this new guy from Hope, Arkansas, who promised with his new covenant stump speech, quote, the most irresponsible people of all in the 1980s, said Bill Clinton, were those at the top of the ladder, the inside traders, the quick buck artists, the S&L kingpins who looked out for themselves and not for the countries. CEOs, Clinton told us, who pay themselves 100 times what they pay the average worker, shouldn't get big pay raises unrelated to performance. If a company wants to overpay its executives and underinvest in the future or transfer jobs overseas, it shouldn't get special treatment and tax breaks from the Treasury. But that's not quite how he governed. He also said, Clinton, he promised us all Americans should have universal access to quality, affordable health care, not as a privilege, but as a right. But instead, he signed NAFTA, which Reagan had negotiated, began the it basically just continued Reagan's policies, at least his economic policies, transferring, tens of millions of jobs overseas, 60,000 factories closed in the United States as a result of this. Clinton tragically echoed Reagan, basically, declaring an end to welfare as we know it and an end to the era of big government. Healthcare became more expensive, and the number of people being imprisoned exploded, even as crime was going down. So we went for another peaceful revolution with George W. Bush in 2000. On the campaign trail, he had said, by far the vast majority of my tax cuts will go to the bottom end of the spectrum. Of course, that's not how it worked out. Bush cut taxes on the very, very rich, like himself and his dynastic family. And we're still in the hole about $1 trillion a year from the Bush tax cuts. And he also promised that he was going to protect Social Security and Medicare. The Social Security surplus must be locked away only for Social Security, he said. Right. Instead, he pushed through a reform that made it a criminal matter for Medicare administrators to even try to negotiate pharmaceutical prices, and put a huge hole in Medicare with this notorious Medicare Advantage scam, which has now moved over 40% of seniors from actual Medicare to these privatized and usually for-profit Advantage plans with their in-network requirements and continual battles to get paid for services and things like that. So we said, okay, we want another peaceful revolution. And we went with Barack Obama in 2008. In his campaign, he promised to allow Medicare to negotiate cheaper drug prices, make it easier for workers to unionize, create 2 million new jobs by building new infrastructure all across the nation, close the loopholes in the deductibility of CEO pay to get that under control, and, quote, eliminate special tax breaks for oil and gas companies, including repealing special expensing rules, foreign tax credit benefits, and manufacturing deductions for oil and gas firms. None of that, of course, happened. Obama did nothing about the Medicare Advantage scam. Americans still didn't have a right to health care. Now, and a lot of Americans today are suffering under an average $5,900 in deductibles and copays from the Obamacare plans. Now, it was a good start, right? I'm not totally trashing Obamacare here. It was a good start. And Obama did restore the reputation of our country after 8 years of torturers and murderers, Bush and Cheney. But we didn't get what we asked for or were promised. And as if to add insult to injury, he refused for a year to use the bully pulpit of the White House to pressure Mitch McConnell into holding hearings on Merrick Garland. So we got another crazed right-winger. So then Donald Trump came along in 2016, and he said, oh, I've got your progressive revolution. Just give it to me. See, each one of these elections, we were promised a progressive revolution. Trump said he's going to give every American health care that is terrific and so much better, so much better. He said we're going to rebuild our aging infrastructure with a massive renovation program. He said I'm going to rescue and expand Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid without any program cuts. He promised to make medical marijuana available to all Americans. He said he was going to bring home all our jobs from China, Mexico, and Japan. He said he was going to tax Ford at the time was planning on building a new factory in Mexico. He said, we will tax you 35% when you bring those cars back into the United States and any other company that moves overseas. Ford went ahead and built the plant. Trump never did anything. He said, I'm going to force Apple to make its computers, phones, and other products here in America again. Right. He said he was going to end all income taxes on couples earning less than $50,000 a year, and that he was going to raise taxes on the rich, quote, so badly that my rich friends will hate me, and it's going to cost me a fortune, end quote. He said he was going to require universal background checks for gun purchases and make sure that, quote, states are properly uploading criminal and mental health records, end quote. He said he was going to make federal funding available to help people addicted to prescription opioids and heroin. He said he was going to stop lobbyists from corrupting politicians and drain the swamp. Remember that chant? He said he was going to guarantee health care to all Americans, regardless of pre-existing conditions or income. And he was going to, quote, give 6 weeks of paid maternity leave to any mother with a newborn child whose employer does not provide the benefit, end quote. Which, by the way, is in the Build Back Better plan. None of that, of course, happened. Instead, it was largely the reverse. So in 2020, again, we tried a peaceful revolution. And we elected Joe Biden. And he's actually trying to keep the promises of a peaceful revolution for the first time in 40 years. He's got this Build Back Better program that expands Medicare to include vision and dental and hearing aids, would let Medicare negotiate drug prices, would provide free community college, would invest in green infrastructure, would give young families access to free or affordable pre-K education or childcare, and would fund it all by closing tax loopholes on the rich while slightly raising rates on people earning over $400,000 a year and on highly profitable corporations. 100% of Republicans in Congress are opposed to this. 100% of them. Do you want a peaceful revolution? Tough luck, buddy. That's the Republican mantra. And, of course, you got 2 sold-out Democrats who have joined the Republicans in this. Or are saying, what about my, Joe Manchin, what about my fossil fuel industry? And Kyrsten Sinema, what about my friends in Big Pharma? They are openly defying the President of the United States and the leader of their party and the leader of the United States Senate. Now, frankly, I think that if, I'm not, actually, I was going to talk about Schumer. I'm not even going to get into that right now. Anyhow, meanwhile, we've got right-wing militias getting in the faces of school boards and taking over positions on election boards. There's this continuous undercurrent of talk on right-wing social media pages and groups about a second civil war. They've adopted the Confederate black flag, which meant no surrender, we will fight to our death, as one of their own. And Biden and Pelosi and Schumer are now engaged in this frantic negotiation with Sinema and Manchin to try to get what Americans have been begging for 40 years past. Somebody needs to tell Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. If you thought January 6th was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. If the Republicans take power again, or, just the Republicans and all their buddies they're openly talking about this. Armed insurrection, arresting elected officials. It's amazing. Anyhow, we'll be right back. It's 18 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And on top of that, now there's this whole new plan to put fascism into place on the part of the Republicans. And welcome back. Omar in Herndon, Virginia. Hey, Omar, what's on your mind today?
Thom Hartmann, the prophet, truth, justice, democracy, prosperity, and the American way. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, Omar.
Good. I was watching C-SPAN and Lindsey Scam, Lindsey Graham, but I call him Lindsey Scam. He was on C-SPAN, and he basically said that Trump, 2024, Trump presidency, it's for him to take it pretty much. It's something that effect, that if he won it, it's for him to take it. Now, I thought there was a bill or a law passed to prevent him from running again. I could be wrong. I just want to know.
There was no law passed. Probably what you're thinking of is the 14th Amendment, which chapter or paragraph or section, I guess it's called section 3 of the 14th Amendment, says that if you have encouraged or participated in an armed insurrection against the United States, you may not hold public office in the future. And the problem is that somebody has to actually do something about that. Like, Congress needs to pass a law that says, he did this, or he needs to be found guilty in a court of law. That has, or an impeachment. And an impeachment, of course, the impeachment clause of the Constitution explicitly says that if you are impeached and convicted, that you can no longer serve in any public office, even dog catcher if it's an elected office. But Trump was not convicted in the Senate, so he's still eligible to run.
He's still eligible to run. And the other thing is, I don't know if you've been following the Virginia gubernatorial race.
I have been.
In Virginia, in the beginning, to my surprise, the Democratic McAuliffe, he was trailing, but he kind of caught up a little bit, and his message was very simple. It's basically jobs, increasing the minimum wage, having a better health care, attacking COVID. He's keeping it basically dealing with kitchen table issues versus his opponent, Youngkin, is basically just talking about law and order, borderline Willie Horton ad that he's running in Virginia over here, and it's not working. And I think McAuliffe will be elected because his message is very simple. It's kitchen sink issue tables, and that's something that Democrats need to make a note of. Thank you so much, Tom.
That's okay, Omar. A quick question. The last opinion poll I saw showed the two of them in a dead heat, essentially, that it's a race that's impossible to call. I didn't know that Terry McAuliffe was behind initially. But
in the beginning, when he started, he was a little bit behind, but he caught up because he's sticking to the meshes, kitchen sink table issues.
Is it your sense that Virginia has become a blue state, and if so, why?
I think it's definitely demographic. It's closer to D.C. It is a blue state. It's closer to D.C. We still have pocket of red in Virginia. If you go closer to Richmond area, Norfolk area, all the way up to Roanoke, that's basically still red, closer to the North Carolina border. But Northern Virginia is basically what's keeping Virginia blue. And
would that be what has essentially become the D.C. suburbs, Alexandria in that area?
Exactly. Alexandria, Fairfax, all the way up to Prince William County, and that is changing. A lot of it's very diverse. A lot of Latin people, a lot of Ethiopian, a lot of different international people, and it's kind of keeping Virginia blue. But it's also it's the area where it sends most tax money to the state. And
because it's a prosperous area. Yeah, high-income areas tend to be blue. Yeah, I get it. Omar, thank you. Thanks for the information. I appreciate it. Good to talk to you. 22 minutes past the hour. Give me 60 seconds to pay some bills on the commercial side, and we will be right back. Stick around. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. So we have a new video op-ed over at thomhartmann.com. So have you ever heard of molnupiravir? It's a new drug that actually looks like it reduces the probability that you will end up hospitalized or dead from COVID-19. It's a 5-day course. You take a pill every day for 5 days. It costs Merck, the company that is selling it, $17.74 to make that 5-day, 5 pills. And they are selling it to you and me, to the federal government, for $712 per 5 pills, per, treatment course. And you say, what? And here's where it gets really interesting. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which is part of the Department of Defense, provided $10 million of funding to Emory University to develop this drug, and $19 million in additional grants came from the National Institutes of Health. We paid to develop this drug, and now we're going to pay $700 for it? Really? Check it out. There's a video over at thomhartmann.com all about it. Well, welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Okay, Judd Legum published this piece this morning on his popular.info website, newsletter, whatever you want to call it, Substack newsletter. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. It is happening right in front of all of us. This is their plan for 2024. And increasingly, it's looking like they may well pull it off. It's like maybe we need to start planning now for what do we do when Trump is president, Republicans have taken the House and Senate, and they begin cracking down on democracy all across this country. They start putting, left-wing talk show hosts in jail, or they start putting, former Democratic secretaries of state and attorneys general in jail, as they threatened to do this week to the Democratic Secretary of State, Attorney General in the state of Michigan, Dana Nessel. Dana Nessel, I think is her name. In any case, the three steps that Judd Legum lays out are, number one, rig the elections by putting Trump loyalists in charge of the key election administration in the key swing states. See, they really only need to focus this on 8 or 9 states, the current and potential swing states. And some of these, like Texas, for example, has the potential to be a swing state. It's very close to being a purple state. Texas ceased to be a white majority state in 2004, but that had to do with births. Those births are now, 2004 was 18 years ago? Am I doing my math right in my head? 16 years ago? 16, 17 years ago. So in the next couple of years, that, the electorate, the people eligible to vote in Texas will no longer be majority white. And that's, I think, why you're seeing all this hysteria. So anyhow, they're looking, at going after the election administration in key states. Trump has officially endorsed candidates, right-wing Trumpies, for Secretary of State in Arizona, in Michigan, and in Georgia. 15, a Reuters report says, quote, 15 declared Republican candidates for Secretary of State in 5 battleground states, Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nevada, found that 10 of the 15 candidates have either declared that the 2020 election was stolen or called for their state's results to be invalidated or further investigated. The Secretary of State, of course, is the chief election officer for the state in most states. And by the way, the companies that are supporting this through the Republican State Leadership Committee are General Motors, Eli Lilly, Facebook, Walmart, AT&T, and Walgreens, principal supporters. Part 2 of this strategy, elect Trump loyalists as governors. This is in next year, in 2022. This is key to his strategy, and he's endorsing Republican candidates all across the country. The companies supporting that, by the way, Eli Lilly, Walgreens, Charter Communications, Boeing, and Deloitte. And number 3, put Trump loyalists in charge of Congress. 2/3 of Republicans on January 6th voted to ignore the outcome of the election and make Donald Trump president. If they can take the House, here we are. I mean, if they take the House, that's it. It's game over. We are over. Anyhow, and Sean, I think we're in our book report here. We'll be right back.
The real causes of depression and the unexpected solutions.
Today, we're reading about Thunderdome politics, an uncivil war taking back our democracy in an age of Trumpian disinformation and Thunderdome politics by Greg Sargent, the Washington Post columnist. This is from his chapter on voter suppression. It's page 37. Republicans and Democrats inhabit different political realities, as mentioned in a previous chapter. But there are certain facts about our politics that are just objectively true. One of them is this. Generally speaking, efforts to make it harder to vote are almost always pushed by Republicans. You cannot understand what is happening in American politics right now without recognizing this stark and very fundamental difference between the two major political parties. During this decade, procedural hurdles were put into place in around 20 states that in some manner or other have made it harder to vote or to register to vote
or have undone previous efforts to make voting or registering easier, or have otherwise threatened serious disenfranchisement. Most of them were the creation of Republican lawmakers and officials. The difference in the two parties' national platforms for 2016 tells the story. The GOP platform champions additional hurdles that are absurdly disproportionate to the phantom abuse it alleges, while the Democratic platform champions multiple specific ways to make it easier to vote, not harder. The most common and controversial of methods used by Republicans to suppress Democratic turnout is the requirement that would-be voters present identification at the polls. The game here tends to turn on requiring forms of ID that some groups are less likely to have, making participation harder for them. Other restrictions include techniques like cutting back on early voting and making it harder to register, both of which have, in recent years, been instituted in multiple states. Republicans who have passed laws making it harder to vote have tended to claim such measures are necessary to protect against, quote, voter fraud. We'll look at this in more detail below, but for now, note that most of the states that have passed such measures did so while under Republican control. As New York University political scientist Samuel Isikoff has memorably put it, the single predictor necessary to determine whether a state will impose voter access restrictions is whether Republicans control the ballot access process. Scholars trace the modern era of warfare over election rules to the intensely contested presidential election of 2000, in which a divided Supreme Court halted the recount in Florida, throwing the presidency to George W. Bush. The closeness and partisan acrimony of that contest, combined with the intense national focus on election rules that accompanied the court battle over it, helped persuade both parties to invest much more attention and energy on those rules. As a result, both the implementation of measures restricting the ballot and the legal battles over them have intensified in recent years. A brief glance at the surprising history of voter ID laws begins to tell the story of this tightening. In the 1970s, several states implemented voter ID measures, but all of them provided for ways that voters without the proper ID could cast a ballot. By 2000, there were 14 such laws, and they had been implemented by politicians in both parties. But by the mid-2000s, amid rising post-2000 acrimony, a handful of red states began implementing voter ID laws that the nonpartisan National Conference of State Legislatures described as, quote, strict, meaning that they make it easy to disqualify those who don't pass muster. After one of those laws in Indiana was challenged and then upheld in 2008 by the Supreme Court, an escalation began that gained momentum in the Obama era. From 2010 onward, the adoption of voter ID laws in general, and of strict ones in particular, accelerated. Though a handful were blocked in the courts, as of this writing, a total of 34 states have voter ID laws in effect, 24 that are deemed non-strict and 10 that are deemed strict. The strict ones are in red states or in swing states where they were implemented by Republicans. The story is very similar if you evaluate the state's voting rules in a broader way, by including not just voter ID measures, but also cutbacks to early voting and restrictions on registration. Here the trend is just as pronounced. After the 2010 elections, the Brennan Center for Justice documented a sharp rise in efforts to pass such measures in the state legislatures across the country. Not all these efforts bore fruit, but many did. By the time voting took place in Election Day 2016, some 14 states had these new restrictions in place for the first time in a presidential election. Now, as of this writing, by the Brennan Center's count, some 20 states have successfully implemented either strict voting ID requirements or cutbacks to early voting, or restrictions on registration, or other measures with meaningful disenfranchising effects. If you're a liberal who's frustrated by the seemingly unbreakable Republican dominance of national politics, not to mention GOP control of most state governments across the country, then the chances are that these restrictions figure heavily into your explanation of this GOP supremacy. Indeed, social media has been absolutely saturated in recent years with variations of the lament that Republican political dominance is largely maintained through a combination of nefarious and undemocratic tactics, such as ballot restrictions that keep constituencies unfriendly to the GOP from voting, and extreme.
Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. And Eddie in, hang on just a second here. There we go. Midwest City, Oklahoma. Hey, Eddie, what's on your mind today?
Pleasure talking to you, John. I have been observing a few things in my short period of life, and history does seem to repeat itself. And as it stands right now, we have what I would consider a bunch of grouchy old people, which is grand old party, running everything, and basically they want to turn it into Nazi Germany in 1936.
Well, 33, I'd say, but yeah.
Well, 33 to 36, basically we're about 34 right now is what they're doing. Trying to overthrow our voting the way it's going. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be progressively getting worse. And I don't understand how we have so many educated people that are following this. They want to remove history from schools. So if we don't know history, we're going to repeat it. This is inevitable. Yeah. But what it comes down to, from the conception of their deception, collusion through their delusion, we are being programmed to perceive what they choose us to believe. And it's getting really where about 6 to 7 multi-conglomerate news organizations put 60 or 70 people in front of us for us to believe. And we don't get a chance to hear anybody else.
It's a sad state of affairs, Eddie. I would argue that if you want to make a Germany comparison, that we are closer to late 1932, early 1933, or maybe even a little bit before that. Hitler in 1922, as I'm recalling, maybe 23, did his, gave his speech in the beer hall in Munich, and then led a mob of about 1,000 or a couple thousand people down to the Bavarian state capital and tried to march in and arrest the governor of Bavaria and overthrow the government of Bavaria as the beginning of overthrowing the German Republic. He was arrested and sent to prison, and where he wrote Mein Kampf in prison. But when he came out of prison, the principal way that he rehabilitated himself, in addition to giving speeches around the country, is he hooked up with a woman who was the widow of one of the 30-some-odd guys who were killed by the police during that attempt to overthrow the Munich government. It was far more violent than what we saw on January 6th, but only a little bit, right? But the police, there was a large police presence, and the police actually fired on the mob when they started attacking the Capitol building, and they killed 30-some-odd people. He took the wife of one of these people, turned her into a martyr, and there's a... in fact, in my daily Hartmann report yesterday, there's an actual hot link to a photo, which I got from Dean Obeidallah, but it's in the archives, the Hitler archives, of Hitler with this woman. I'm forgetting her name. And he turned her into a martyr, which is exactly what Trump is trying to do with Ashley Babbitt right now. And that was one of the ways that he acquired enough political power that in 1933, when the Reichstag was on fire, he was able to give a famous speech. It was sort of his George W. Bush moment. He was not yet in power or in charge. And then, over the course of the next few months, von Papen and Hindenburg said, okay, cool, we'll put you in charge of Germany. We'll make you chancellor if you'll just be a nice guy and quiet down and stop being so hysterical and so weird, figuring that he would turn from a radical fascist into a normal politician once he got political power. And, of course, that's not how it worked out. And so I think that that's really the moment that we're at. And if he becomes president again, then we will be in that era. And let's keep in mind, I mean, Hitler did a lot of things that were very popular with the German people at first. I mean, obviously his attacking the Jews was, well, actually that was popular with a lot of German people. Germany was largely white and Christian, and the Jews had been trashed for years and years and years. But the main things that he did, he built the Autobahn, he designed the Volkswagen. He revived the German economy. In 1937, just before he invaded Poland, Time magazine put Adolf Hitler on the cover of its magazine as the man of the year because he was the most popular politician in the world at that point in time. He was even polling higher in Germany than Franklin Roosevelt was in the United States in 1937. Now, 37 was a low year for Roosevelt. He was tied up in the whole, packing the court thing and all this stuff. But and he had kind of pulled back from his programs a little bit to mollify the Republicans. But that's where I think we're at, Eddie. And I can't argue with your analysis. It's very, very, very troubling. Thank you very much for the call. John in Kansas City, Missouri. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Thank
Hey,
you
John.
for taking my call, Tom.
Sure, you're on the air.
And I was just going over at least one aspect of your rant about medical. And I started, since from Bill Clinton, and when they tried to pass Hillary Care,
Right.
try to pass the public option, it was really knocked down by Democrats. Same thing with Obama. Obama wanted.
Well, hang on just a second, John. It was knocked down by 100% of Republicans and a small handful of turncoat Democrats like Joe Lieberman who knocked down the public option in Obamacare. Let's be careful that we don't give Republicans a pass on this. 100% of the Republicans in the Senate right now are opposed to President Biden's agenda. 2 Republicans could make Manchin and Sinema irrelevant.
Yes, but also Bill Nelson stood in the way. Joe Stupak stood in the way. And I'm calling on the centrist Democrats. It's like I'm watching this show again. We get close to the precipice of getting exactly what we want. But then we get these beating so for religious reasons like Stupak or Bill Nelson, who made
right now it's Josh Gottheimer and friends in the House, and it's Manchin and Sinema in the Senate. Kurt Schrader here in the House of Representatives, the guy from Oregon. What was it, Kathleen Rice, I think, from New York State. Scott Peters from California. They all voted against allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices because they're taking money from the big pharma.
Exactly. And the thing is this, I'm a veteran. I'm a disabled veteran. And I don't have to use Medicare, and I'm getting close to Medicare age. But I truly feel for these people that are on Medicare Advantage and not getting the able to negotiate prescription drugs like I get through the VA. Right. It's abominable to me. It really is. And for these Democrats to stand in the way of that, like I said, it always seems like as soon as we get close to the finish line, it's a centrist Democrat that sticks his foot out to trip us up.
Right. And they shouldn't be called centrists. They should be called corporatists, because the center in America right now is exactly where Joe Biden is. Let's do this.
Yeah, exactly. So my thing is this, and this is where I'm starting to come to the AOC model. Perhaps we need to take a page from the Republican playbook, and before a Democrat runs, have to have something on our platform to make sure we can't have another Christian Sinema. In other words, we can't have somebody saying that they're going to do something and say all the things as soon as they get in and the money starts hitting them, then they change, they flip. So in a sense, we have to take a page from their playbook and from the Republican playbook and primary these guys.
Yeah, I'm with you.
No apologies.
I'm with you, John. I'm 100% with you. And this is, and the Josh Gottheimer, I mean, anybody who has no labels, problem solvers, or blue dogs after their name.
They're Republicans.
Right, exactly. And the excuse is, oh, well, they're from conservative districts, and the conservatives in those districts really want somebody who's sort of like the Republicans. That is simply not true. Bernie Sanders won all 55 counties, I believe it's 55, in West Virginia in that primary in 2016. He won every single county. Progressives actually win elections. The problem is that the party in many cases, in many of these states, is also captured by big industry. And so, they're only putting up the Josh Gottheimers and Scott and Kurt Schraders of the world for the Democratic nomination. And then you're forced into a choice, as Arizonans were with Kyrsten Sinema, when she first ran for the Senate. You're forced into a choice between a corporate Democrat or a corporate, insane, fascist Republican. And that's not a difficult choice. But still, you end up with a corporate Democrat who is sabotaging what, for 40 years, the American people have been saying, we would really like this. We would like to join Canada and have a decent standard of living and a peaceful place to live. We would like to join Europe and have a decent standard of living and a national health care system and free college for our kids. And instead, we've got what we've got. John, thank you for the call. Very well said. Dylan in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Hey, Dylan, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, I say all or nothing. All or nothing. If they don't want to agree, if they want to keep on bringing it down, bringing the Build Back Better plan down to 1.5 trillion, I say just forget it. Just don't do it.
Well, here's the problem, Dylan. If the Democrats say nothing, if the so-called centrists, if the corporate paid off, if the bought off Democrat, I think we just need to start calling them what they are. If the bought off Democrats bring down President Biden's plans, and let's make it clear, this is not Bernie Sanders' plan. Bernie Sanders' plan was a $6 to $7 trillion plan. This is Joe Biden's plan. If these paid off Democrats bring down that plan and it goes to zero, then you are going to see Donald Trump or somebody as bad as him as president in 2024.
Well, this is what they need to do. They need to play really hardball. I say that they should plan investigations on Joe Manchin's daughter for all of the crimes she was in and start putting out all of the money that he's getting from his son. He's not voting with us.
Well, that's becoming, his family connections are now in the press. People are becoming aware of it. It's probably troubling him, although maybe he doesn't care. I don't know. Well, but number one, I'm concerned that if we beat these guys up too badly, specifically Sinema and Manchin, either one of them could flip to the Republican Party, which is what Governor Justice did in West Virginia. He got elected as a Democrat, and he declared himself a Trump Republican like a couple of months later. And he's still the governor.
Maybe
and Joe Manchin could do that. Well,
maybe it'll wake them up.
I'm not a fan of going down with the ship, Dylan. I think that if we end up with a $1.5 or $2 trillion package, or something that is good enough that Americans actually feel like life got better, that enhances the chances of the Democratic Party in 2022 and 2024.
What about Biden taking out the military bases in all the states that aren't agreeing with them? Play hardball. Say, okay, any more military bases in Texas, no more in West Virginia. You're out.
I would rather see something that's, like legislation suggesting that states can only get a certain percentage of federal funds back based on what they pay in. A no more welfare for red states bill, something like that. But I get what you're saying. I get how upset you are, but we got to be careful here, Dylan. Thank you for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's 46 minutes past the hour. Both Adam Schiff and Liz Cheney have now come out and said, we are going to prosecute criminally people who don't show up or don't give us documents. And welcome back. Matthew in Oak Parks, California. Hey, Matthew, thanks for listening on TuneIn. What's up?
Hey, Tom. I just wanted to bring up, the graduated income tax system in the United States. I don't think people understand that everybody, even a millionaire, pays the same tax rate on the first $25,000, the first $100,000, and so on till you get to the $400,000. That's where we're trying to raise taxes on income above $400,000. That's, people don't understand. They think we're going to try and raise taxes on the rich. They think we're raising it on all their income.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Matthew, and that's why it's important to, and I try to do this as often as I can remember, to use the phrase tax bracket rather than tax rate, because the top tax bracket was 74% when Reagan came into office. He dropped that top tax bracket down to 25%. And probably I should go in and edit my piece today to reflect that.
It made a huge impact when Reagan did that, because he was 74% applied to income above $1 million, I think, at that time, or 500,000. So when you reduce that rate, they're getting a huge windfall based on what their prior rate was.
Well, that's why, there were no billionaires when Reagan came into office. Now we've got like 700 of them.
Well, I'd make billionaires illegal. At $1 or $2 billion, we start confiscating the money. They have to give it back to the Treasury or whatever.
Yeah, it gets problematic, but I'm with you. In fact, I own the website, nobillionaires.com or .org or both. But yeah, I do actually. It's I haven't done much with it in years. It's got an old clip from years ago on it, but nobillionaires.com.
Well, I saw a lecture from you in Oak Park about 15 to 20 years ago. That was great.
Well,
so you have been in Oak Park, California, which is in Ventura County.
Oh, okay.
And that was a really good time.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Matthew, you got to move. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, one more thing. Just one more quick thing. On annual budget deficits, people have to understand the national debt, the total that they talk about, $30 trillion, is an accumulation of all the years they had deficits, annual budget deficits.
Correct.
And
a good chunk of that debt, about $5 trillion of it, is money that the government owes itself. It's like the Social Security Trust Fund and things like that.
Absolutely.
Federal pension funds.
And you got to remember, like, when Bush left office, there was a budget deficit. When Clinton left, there was a surplus. For Bush Jr.
Same with Jimmy Carter.
And then he left us with a
Jimmy
$1 trillion
Carter and Bill Clinton were the last two presidents to have balanced budgets.
Yeah, and then Bush takes over, and he leaves us with over $1 trillion budget deficit for 1 year. And then Obama comes in and reduces that to about $400 billion.
Right.
And then Trump leaves with $1.6 trillion or whatever.
Right.
So the Republicans
And that's the 1 year
worst.
deficit. Yeah.
They're the worst on the economy. The last 100 years proves it.
Oh yeah, and what you're seeing played out, Matthew, is Jude Wanniski's two Santa Claus theory. That when Republicans control the White House, they should spend money like drunken sailors to make the economy look good and make Americans think that Republicans give you a good economy, but it's just a sugar high.
Yep.
And then cut taxes to raise the budget deficit and thus the national debt, so that when Democrats come into office, they can scream about the national debt, refuse to raise the debt ceiling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to force those Democrats to
right now.
Right, to force those Democrats
right now.
not to spend any more money. You're absolutely right. Yeah, and this is two Santa Clauses, in whatever, on steroids. And in fact, I wrote an op-ed over at HartmannReport.com a couple of weeks ago titled "Santa Claus is about to drop a bomb on Joe Biden." You can read the whole thing, complete with links to the original 1974 or 76 article by Jude Wanniski in the Wall Street Journal. It's all right there. It's not like it's a secret. We'll be back in just a minute. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So we've got a new video up over at ThomHartmann.com for supporters of our program about the 14th Amendment and the debt ceiling. And just kind of riddle me this one, Batman, right? The 14th Amendment reads, and I'm taking out the parts that specifically refer to pensions and bounties, for services suppressing the insurrection, because it came out of the Civil War. But the 14th Amendment reads, in part, the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. In other words, Congress, you can't take actions that might cause the public debt not to be paid. You can't refuse to raise the debt ceiling, is how I read that. The debt ceiling, of course, didn't even exist when they wrote the 14th Amendment. That came along in 1917. But I think this is raising some really important questions, and I dig into it in this video over there. You can check it out. It's all over at ThomHartmann.com. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Sydney in Moore Park, California. Hey, Sydney, what's up?
Hi there. Hi, Tom. I'm grateful again. Okay, I'm trying to deconstruct this. I love that we're taking over the narrative and the nomenclature and redefining who we are. There's no simple solution because we can't, like you said, we can't pressure cinema and Christian and all these, corporatists to the point where they flip on us. But we can continue to pressure, canvass, re-educate. It's all like one word now. That's activism. And I was going to say, and I think, part of that is to continue to build on. We can't have democracy and corporatists in one term. It's just like an oxymoron, it seems. And so I just kind of wanted to roll with that.
That's the problem, is the Supreme Court legalized this. I mean, this is in 2010 with Citizens United. They said, if a billionaire or a corporation wants to own a politician, that's called free speech.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. So that's the power that I feel like progressives and Democrats, we're the same. You know what I mean? Like, we are values. Every time I call and canvass, which is daily to Georgia, by the way, we need everybody on board. Mm-hmm. If somebody needs us in Texas, Georgia, boom.
You're doing phone banking, Sydney?
Oh, yeah, phone banking.
Through what organization? How can people emulate your activities?
Yes, sir. Through MoveOn.org and through Let'sMobilize.org and through postcards. Tony at Postcards, I believe that's on Twitter. Mm-hmm. It's just at every level, step it up. If I'm disabled, okay. I'm a stay-at-home mom, okay. But here's the thing. If I'm having a sick day, I stay home, write postcards. If I'm listening to your show, I'm also writing postcards, or I'm about to do a text bank for an hour a day, sort of like exercise.
You are wonderful.
Sorry. Oh, listen, I don't know. I'm just
wonderful.
grateful. My parents were immigrants. Listen, but no one respects the flag more than my mom, who's just a single mom immigrant. My fathers are all, third generation war veterans.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing. Let's just own it. Let's just own our integrity, own our truth, and then massively get out there. If you're a professor, this is the time to be offering canvassing for school credit. We did that in Northridge and got massive amounts of people out to canvass. And just like, yeah, you know what I mean? It's just like, it just takes like a emptying that cup and just, I don't know.
Did you know that in Montana, Sydney, they passed a law making it illegal, quote, for students to engage in, quote, voter identification efforts, voter registration drives, signature collection efforts, ballot collection efforts, or voter turnout efforts for federal, state, local, or school elections inside a public campus-operated facility. They made it a crime to do what you're talking about doing.
That's insane.
In Montana.
That's insane.
This is what the Republicans just did. Senate Bill 13. It passed. It's been signed by the governor.
Oh, it passed. Oh, my God. So now we got to pass. Then we got to double down. Now we got to pass something to say, you know what? We can canvass. That is democratic. And everything democratic. What is that? What is our values? And, like if I have sorry, I keep rambling, but like if I have a problem at my school or my school district, I don't just call, I call the school board and I engage exactly with who needs to be engaged with. And it's no fear, because fear is, we can't have love, we can't have progress with that. I mean, it's okay. You're doing your amazing job, Thom, of just like giving us the knowledge, but now we are receiving it, and it's like up to us to activate it, I feel like.
Yeah, well,
I don't know.
You're doing a great job, Sydney, and I'm so glad that there's platforms out there like MoveOn.org and the others you mentioned where people can do this. The one thing I would add to the conversation that I had before the break with I'm sorry, I don't recall the name of the caller, but is that, yes, I'm concerned that if we publicly pressure or humiliate Manchin and Sinema too much, or if the president or Schumer does, that they could flip to the Republican Party. And there are Republicans out there who are reaching out to them. I mean, Mitch McConnell a couple of weeks ago was kind of trolling us all by saying, I pray for them every day. But on the other hand, there is private pressure. And Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer are doing their best to bring that private pressure on these two people. And the problem is that, when somebody, it's like being a made man in the mafia. I mean, when you have sold your soul to a giant corporation and danced to their tune for years and years, you don't just suddenly say, sorry, I'm not going to do your bidding anymore. It's very unfortunate. Sydney, thank you. God bless you. What you are doing is the key to the whole thing. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. CB Distillery, CBD for sleep and pain relief. More info is available at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. Ground News, a well-rounded perspective for news readers. More info at ground.news/Tom. Angie, for any project on your to-do list. More info at Angie.com. Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at Dinovite.com. And ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More information at expressvpn.com/Tom.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists. However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had masters' slaves, feudalism had lords' serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So are people rejecting the do you want fries with that economy and this whole minimum wage thing? I mean, we're seeing changes in employment patterns. We're seeing upsets in our supply chains. How much, to what extent are these changes long-term or short-term? How do they change our economy? How much of this is just the result of 700,000 dead and probably several million disabled Americans as a consequence of COVID dropping out of the workforce? Or is there a larger trend here where people are saying, nah, I don't really want to be just, making a living saying, do you want fries with that anymore? 4.3 million workers quit their jobs in the last month, according to a screaming, hysterical headline over on Drudge. The number leaving restaurant jobs and hotels has doubled. Half of Americans say they want to make a career change. On the line with us is Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, also available as an ebook. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff. Professor Wolff, what say you about all this?
Well, I think it deserves a screaming headline. We've never seen numbers, they're called quits in the statistics that the government maintains. Millions of our fellow citizens are quitting their jobs, and everybody is wondering what's going on and connecting this phenomena to the so-called shortage of labor as our business community screams that there aren't enough workers. I want to give you an analysis of this that you're not going to get too often in the mainstream media for reasons that you and I could speculate on, but I'll leave for another time. There's a simple story in economics about what happens if you're short of labor. You need to offer higher wages and better working conditions, and then you can see whether the shortage is eliminated because you've made it worthwhile for people to come to work. Our business employer community doesn't want to do that, and for me, that's the core problem. We are facing a situation where for the last 18 months at least, corporations have not made the kinds of profits, with a few exceptions, of course. Amazon did well and Facebook did and so on. But for the vast majority of our corporations, it's been a rough 18 months, and they want to recoup the losses that they suffered. And how are they doing that? By bringing their workers back into conditions that are less good than they even were before, so that the company can save on the money it might cost at wages that are not very good, are certainly not better than what they were before, and for the few who've had some increase in their wages, the rising inflation has wiped it all out. So what do we got? We got a working class which also had 18 months of great difficulty, coming back to jobs that are lousy in their quality, don't pay very well, at a time when they need more money just to stay even with rising prices, and they're not getting that. I don't see why people are surprised that we have a revolt and a statement of saying, I'm not working here anymore. This is intolerable. And I think the proof of the pudding lies in another statistic which should be alongside the quit statistic. We have a record number of strikes going on in this country. Over the summer, Nabisco, right now, Kellogg, John Deere, bus drivers in Maryland, I'm just reading off a list, janitors at the Denver airport, the nurses strike in St. Vincent's Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, the musicians at San Antonio, Texas Symphony. I tried to collect just a small portion. Those workers are furious at what is being done to them. 60,000 workers are just voted 98% to call a strike that will shut down TV and film production in Hollywood. I mean, we're seeing workers saying no. And I think there's a very deep issue here, which is that the conflict between the employers and the employees that has been caused by the three crashes we've had this century already, and now by the pandemic, and now on top of that by the desire of the employers to recoup what they lost in the pandemic at working people's expense, it's too much, and it is driving people both politically to go in directions they haven't in the past, and now on the job, or maybe I should say off the job at the same time.
Is this a symptom also? I mean, millions of people leaving jobs that are typically called so-called low-wage jobs, but I was in Chicago during the I think it's called the hotel workers strike. I'm forgetting the name of the union, but you had so-called low-wage workers who have unionized, and now they've got decent wages and benefits, and they were striking for better wages and benefits. But, when Reagan came into office, about a third of America was unionized. Now 6% of the private economy, in fact, it might even be below that now, is unionized. To what extent is this, just people are doing what a union would do otherwise, only they're just walking away rather than saying we're going to strike for better wages and benefits because they don't have a union, so they can't strike?
Absolutely. And I think you're seeing the old wisdom. A union is an important organization for workers, but if they don't have one, they're not going to sit quietly and not act. They're going to do things. If the union movement understands this is an opportunity to do the organizing to reverse the last 70 years of decline to the 6% of the private sector that you're quite right is all that's organized now. The workers have been taking it on the chin, in part because their unions have declined and become weaker, and they got to see the writing on the wall, and I think they've seen it. And I think that's why we're having record strikes, we're having record quits. I think the sadness is that the workers who quit will discover that the job they think they can go to is going to be subjecting them to many of the same pressures, that they need a national coordinated push to change the terms of the deal between employer and employee. Otherwise, if they all do it on their own individually, they will have forgotten the lesson that is buried in the word union, that together we have a strength that separately we don't have. And I think you're seeing an American working class relearning that lesson. And if I'm right, we're in for quite some times ahead as this issue gets fought out.
Now, one of the narratives that we see particularly, well, it's not even on the right. I think of it as kind of a neoliberal narrative, but is that you've got people who aren't in the workforce right now because over 40 million Americans have been infected with COVID, and it's looking like at least a third of them are having long-term health consequences as a result of it, ranging from weakness to dementia. So that's taking a number of people, the ones who didn't die. Most of the deaths, initially anyway, were in people who were outside the workforce anyway because they're over 65. But now, it's disabling people. And then number two, that because of COVID and the Republican hysteria around masks and vaccines and things, but particularly masks, people are unwilling to work in jobs where they have to confront these mask holes who come in and try to confront people and get in fights with them. Nobody wants to be a clerk at a store anymore and be the one who has to say to some Republican, no, you've got to lift that mask up over your nose and possibly get shot. I mean, that happened last week. Somebody got shot for simply asking somebody to put on a mask. That those two dynamics of disabled workers from COVID and people who are unwilling to work in a hostile work environment created by Republican hysteria, that those two things will wash out of the economy over the next 3 years as Republicans no longer see a political advantage in this, as the COVID crisis starts to wane, and as new people come into the, younger people come into the workforce to replace those people who've been disabled by COVID. Do you think there's anything to that? I mean, how much, is that a small factor, a large factor, no factor at all?
I think that's a small factor. I think you're dealing here with much more fundamental roots of our economy. For example, the mandates. The people that are objecting to mandates are the same people who don't object to lots of other mandates. If you assume, for example, if you pass an intersection in your car and the light turns red, that's the government which organized that light and which runs that light and will arrest you if you don't observe the law imposed on you to stop your vehicle when the light is red so you don't kill everybody. And people understand it, they accept it. The same person who accepts that is all bent out of shape because they have a mandate to wear a mask, which has the same logic of saving lives behind it. When people act in that contradictory, irrational way, the problem has to be understood. What is going on here? It isn't what it says it is. This isn't about a mandate about masks. This is people who have had enough, who are angry, who don't know quite where to put their anger, whether they understand that it's their wages that are no good, or the prices rising that they can't afford, or the job conditions that are unbearable, or the COVID disaster that struck their grandmother, or whatever it is. And so they're casting about, as people will, for something to attach their upset to. And there come the Republicans with an opportunity to hold on to some political advantage by getting behind the crazy gesture that troubled people focus on until they kind of clear their head and realize that's not their problem. I think you're seeing that spread across the country.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense, and in a way, it's kind of reassuring that that would be a small part of the issue here. Professor Richard Wolff, always great talking with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
Professor Wolff's website's democracyatwork.info. His new book, The Sickness is the System. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And you can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, PROFWOLFF, Professor Richard Wolff. We'll be back. And welcome back. Tom in Huntington Beach, California. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today?
Hey, good to hear you, Tom. I got two main points. One is the whole Trump playbook is a psychological ploy based on an ancient archetype, thousands of years old, good versus evil, villain versus hero.
Sure.
And he always treats everyone else as a villain and himself as the hero. Thus, when people vote, everyone wants to vote for a hero, not a villain.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, and the second big thing is this demonization is so bad. I have a lifelong friend up in Washington. I'm in California. He said, "Oh, you're living in a communist state now," and I'm just going to start calling them the way I look because I looked at 200 videos from this guy in 2 years, researched each one, and 90% of them was Breitbart, RT News, Russian videos. So I'm starting to call all Trumpers Russian communist propaganda sympathizers.
Yeah, except that the Russians aren't communists anymore. They're uber capitalists and oligarchs, but everything else, yeah, I get it. And it's, by the way, there's now increasing evidence that a lot of the churn, a lot of the trolls on social media are not just coming from Russia, that the people pretending to be Americans and stoking outrage and trying to get people out in the streets, that they're also coming from China. We're in a conflict with China. That they're also coming from Saudi Arabia and actually it was the United Arab Emirates that was fingered in one of the news stories. I mean, we've got literally foreign governments that do not like, a pesky democracy hanging around in the world, setting an example for the world to the extent that we used to anyway. And they're trying to bring us down. But on everything else, I'm with you. Thank you very much, Tom. Great to hear from you. Les in Winnemucca, Nevada. Hey, Les, what's on your mind today?
Hey, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
Your previous caller there just kind of stole my thunder. Mine's from, Trump's just a con man, and that's all he's ever been.
Oh, yeah.
And he latched onto the Republican Party, and his whole presidency has been a con job.
But see, that's the thing. The whole Republican Party has been a con job since 1980 when Reagan was elected. It's been a grift. It's a 40-year-long grift.
Yeah, they've kind of turned into that, and it's too bad because we need people that can think critically on both sides of an issue, but people that are trying to solve the issue, not create problems.
Right.
And Sinema and Manchin, I realize that they're getting their money from, where they're getting it. And so they feel that they've got a problem. But sometimes you got to just turn around and tell your donor, look, I'm going to watch that for you all I can. Mm-hmm. But this time you got to bite the bullet. You're going to have to take one. There's one other thing I want to say real quick, and then I'll get out of here. I don't understand why the rich class isn't willing to feed the goose that's laying them the golden egg.
You're talking the working class.
Yeah.
Why the rich people won't feed the working class. It makes no sense to me either, Les. In the grand scheme, it seems very, very short-sighted, but it's like this is something they've been doing for 7,000 years. So, it's like this, the rule of the rich goes back literally to ancient Sumeria. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. The media is pushing this crazy narrative that with regard to masks and vaccines and COVID and all this kind of stuff, that America is divided. Like, half of us want masks and half of us don't, or half of us want vaccines. It's just not true. 75% of Americans have received at least one dose of vaccine. 70% of Americans think that we should have mask mandates in all of our schools. Only 17%, this is from the latest Pew studies, polling, only 17% of Americans are opposed to mask mandates in schools. And what we have is this tiny fringe that is being cranked. Now we're learning from China as well as from Russia and perhaps other countries, plus the people in, a relatively small number of people, Trump followers, who think that tearing the country apart is a good thing and somehow it'll hurt Joe Biden and hurt the Democrats in the next election. It's crazy. I got a whole video rant about this over at ThomHartmann.com that you can check out. Oh, what a day. Kevin in Boulder, Colorado. Hey, Kevin, what's on your mind today?
Hey, my comment is towards the professor, and it's kind of a rebuttal of firsthand experience of and it's the workforce that we have going on today. And I would like to call it the employees that have work ethic. So whether the employees that had work ethic got laid off or stayed at work through the COVID crisis, they have all moved up, or they went if they got laid off, they went into another field. The people without the work ethic took as much time off as that unemployment would allow, giving them money. And now that those people are having to go back to work, they're finding that this is firsthand experience that the people that have moved up, and whether it's a small company or a big company, aren't the ones that have the education or maybe even be the most intelligent on the floor. They have the most work ethic that show up to work day to day. And so they're being very disheartened. They're disheartened by they're taking orders by somebody maybe younger, less educated, and they're like, man, I should be making as much as that person because I'm older than them or I'm more wise, but it's going to take them more time to build that seniority back up. And the same would go for unions too. And they're just quitting. They're like, hell, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to take orders from that younger employee / less educated.
So if work ethic is a phrase that has been that has meant a lot of things over the years, and is typically used by Republicans to accuse largely poor people or minorities of not wanting to work. But what I've observed in all the years of my life is that pretty much, there's probably 2, 3, 4% of Americans who literally will just take advantage of the system and live on welfare or whatever, given an opportunity. But that's not normal. That the vast majority of people actually want to work. They just don't want to work at meaningless work or at work that is paid way less than it should be. I mean,
I'll agree with you on that. I'll totally agree with you on that. But what has happened is that the COVID crisis said, hey, I'm not saying they didn't have work ethic, but they're like, hey, stay home, or companies laid them off or went under during the COVID crisis.
Yeah, that's more of it.
They've had to then they've had to come back and compete, coming back into another job field or the same job career field, but then another company that has made it through the pandemic and thrived, let's say, and they're just coming in as entry level, and then they're super frustrated. It doesn't need to be entry level fast food, what have you. It could be HVAC work, it could be plumbing work, it could be computer tech. It's like, hey, why is this 25-year-old guy?
Yeah, but if you're getting a decent paycheck, Kevin, and you're getting decent benefits, does it really matter that the guy who or the woman who is your supervisor is younger than you?
Oh, absolutely. People go to disgruntled employees all the time when they feel lack of respect. Absolutely, they don't want to go to work. And I hate to say it about the sexist crap.
No, I get it. Kevin, I got to run, but thank you. We'll be back in just a minute. Stick around. It's going to get interesting.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
The Republicans want to say, okay, you want to give a child tax credit to people? Let's attach a work requirement to that. Let's discuss that right after this break.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club, and today we're reading from Arundhati Roy's brilliant book, Capitalism, A Ghost Story. This is from the afterword, at the very end of the book. Yesterday morning, the police cleared Zuccotti Park, but today the people are back. The police should know that this protest is not a battle for territory. We're not fighting for the right to occupy a park here or there. We're fighting for justice. Justice is not just for the people of the United States, but for everybody. What you've achieved since September 17th, when the Occupy movement began in the United States, is to introduce a new imagination, a new political language into the heart of the empire. You've reintroduced the right to dream into a system that tried to turn everybody into zombies, mesmerized into equating mindless consumerism with happiness and fulfillment. As a writer, let me tell you, this is an immense achievement. I cannot thank you enough. We are talking about justice. Today, as we speak, the Army of the United States is waging a war of occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan. U.S. drones are killing civilians in Pakistan and beyond. Tens of thousands of U.S. troops and death squads are moving into Africa. If spending trillions of dollars of your money to administer occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan is not enough, a war against Iran is being talked up. Ever since the Great Depression, the manufacture of weapons and the export of war have been key ways in which the United States has stimulated its economy. Just recently, under President Obama, the United States made a $60 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia. It hopes to sell thousands of bunker busters to the United Arab Emirates. It has sold $5 billion worth of military aircraft to my country, India, my country, which has more poor people than all the poorest countries of Africa put together. All these wars, from the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to Vietnam, Korea, Latin America, have claimed millions of lives. All of them fought to secure the, quote, American way of life, end quote. Today we know that the American way of life, the model that the rest of the world is meant to aspire toward, has resulted in 400 people owning the wealth of half the population of the United States. It has meant thousands of people being turned out of their homes and jobs while the U.S. government bailed out banks and corporations. American International Group alone was given $182 billion in the bailout. The Indian government worships U.S. economic policy. As a result of 20 years of the free market economy, today 100 of India's richest people own assets equal to 1/4 of the country's GDP, while more than 80% of Indian people live on less than 50 cents a day. 250,000 farmers driven into a spiral of death have committed suicide. We call this progress and now think of ourselves as a superpower. Like you, we are well qualified, we have nuclear bombs and obscene inequality. The good news is that people have had enough and are just not going to take it anymore. The Occupy movement has joined thousands of other resistance movements all over the world in which the poorest of people are standing up and stopping the richest corporations in their tracks. Few of us dreamed that we would see it, the people of the United States on our side, trying to do this in the heart of empire. I don't know how to communicate the enormity of what this means. The 1% say we don't have demands. They don't know, perhaps, that our anger alone would be enough to destroy them. But there are some things, a few pre-revolutionary thoughts I had for us to think about together. We want to put a lid on this system that manufactures inequality. We want to put a cap on the unfettered accumulation of wealth and property by individuals as well as corporations. As capitalists and Liddites, we demand, 1, an end to cross-ownership in business. For example, weapons manufacturers cannot own TV stations. Mining corporations cannot run newspapers. Business houses cannot fund universities. Drug companies cannot control public health funds. 2, natural resources and essential infrastructure, water supply, electricity, health, and education cannot be privatized. 3, everybody must have a right to shelter, education, and health care. 4, the children of the rich cannot inherit their parents' wealth. This struggle has reawakened our imagination. Somewhere along the line, capitalism reduced the idea of justice to mean just human rights. The idea and the idea of dreaming of equality became blasphemous. We're not fighting to tinker with reforming a system that needs to be replaced. As a capist and a Lidite, I salute your struggle. Salam and Zimbad Dad. That's the end of the book. This is from the very opening of it, chapter 1. Is it a house or a home, a temple to the new India, or a warehouse for its ghosts? Ever since Antilla arrived in Altamont Road in Mumbai, exuding mystery and a quiet menace, things have not been the same. Here we are, the friend who took me there said. Pay your respects to our new ruler. Antilla belongs to India's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. I'd read about this most expensive dwelling ever built, the 27 floors, 3 helipads, 9 lifts, hanging gardens, ballrooms, weather rooms, gymnasiums, 6 floors of parking, and 600 servants. Nothing had prepared me for the vertical lawn, a soaring 27-story high wall of grass attached to a vast metal grid. The grass was dry in patches, bits have fallen off in neat rectangles, clearly trickle down hadn't worked. But gush up certainly has. That's why in a nation of 1.2 billion, India's 100 richest people own assets equivalent to 1/4 of the GDP. And then Arundhati Roy goes on from there talking about how India is kind of an example of capitalism run amok. Capitalism, a Ghost Story by Arundhati Roy.
Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. 34 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Rebecca Vallas is on the line with us, senior fellow at the Century Foundation, formerly with the Center for American Progress, where she helped build Poverty to Prosperity, the Poverty Prosperity Program, and the host of the Off Kilter Show and podcast. Her Twitter handle, Rebecca Vallas, REBECCAVALLAS, or at Off Kilter Show. Rebecca, it's great talking with you again. It's been quite a while. Tell us about the demand, I guess is the appropriate word, that if we're going to give a child tax credit, a break basically to young families who are raising children, that we're going to, I guess this isn't means testing, have a work requirement attached to it?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tom. And it's a pleasure to be back on the show. And it has been a minute, although I feel like I've lost all sense of time in COVID. But you're exactly right. Here we are right now, 4 months into the expanded child tax credit, something that many of us have been calling a child allowance, which is akin to a policy that most other developed nations have. This is a policy that is estimated to cut child poverty in the U.S. by half in the next year, and it was one of the big and kind of most well-known parts of the American Rescue Plan Act that was signed into law in March of this year, expanding the child tax credit in really substantial ways. We're in a place now where 4 months into this policy, we're seeing that kids and families' lives are already being dramatically changed for the better. Hunger cut by a third, according to census data that gives us a snapshot of what's going on with families. But now, in the context of a debate around whether and for how long to extend that expanded child allowance, because Biden signed into law an authorization for this policy to exist for just 1 year, now we're at a point where the senator from West Virginia, who I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with because he has been really standing in the way of a lot of Biden's agenda at this point in the context of what's called Build Back Better, Joe Manchin from West Virginia is single-handedly jeopardizing the future of that new child allowance by demanding that it include so-called work requirements as a condition for its extension beyond that first year. And we can get into why this is just a terrible idea, but it's unfortunately taking us back in time in some ways and rolling the clock back to what feels like a 1980s, 1990s era debate, and yet unfortunately playing out in 2021.
This is a game that conservatives have played with so-called entitlement programs forever. I mean, they're throughout my lifetime anyway, and that's a pretty long time. But certainly it really hit its stride in the 1980s with Reaganism. I mean, they tried to say Social Security should be means tested. Why are billionaires getting Social Security checks? The reason, of course, why is because if everybody's in, and it's less expensive to administer, frankly, and it works well, and I'm sure you have things to add to that why it's a good thing. But they keep and the strategy here, at least my understanding of it, and I'd love to get your take on this, Rebecca Vallas, is number one, turn it from essentially an entitlement, and I realize that's an old slur from the 80s, but I don't have a better word for it. Turn it from a program that everybody is eligible for into something that only people in a certain category, basically low income or, gee, they're working or whatever, but you convert it from a program, from a widespread program into a somewhat narrower program, and then you have the precedent set for chipping away at it, and now you can start to call it a welfare program, and pretty soon it's only available to people who are in a very narrow spectrum, and then you make it harder and harder for them to sign up for it or get access to it. And we've seen this over and over again with everything from food stamp. I mean, it's just right across the board. Anything that is a benefit to people, this is their strategy. Do I have this right?
You've got it right, Tom, as you usually do, and I'll say that of all of the different conservative strategies, right, which are not new. This is not a new idea, and we can talk about where it comes from. But all the conservative strategies out there over the years to shrink effective programs, to make programs really hard to access, and to demonize the people who turn to them. In many ways, the policy that is often called work requirements. I hate calling it that because it's really actually work reporting requirements. It's forced labor. There's a lot of different names for it. It's actually, in many ways, the most nefarious. So this is not a new idea. So-called work requirements, the policy of using survival benefits as a tool to compel paid and usually very low-wage, underpaid work outside the home. It's not a new idea. In fact, folks who listen to your show, watch your show, are probably very familiar that work reporting requirements were the centerpiece of Donald Trump's agenda to dismantle the safety net for the better part of his one-term presidency, including not only harsher limits on SNAP, food assistance for jobless workers, but also an immeasurably cruel policy that stripped health insurance away from unemployed workers through Medicaid. Both of those policies have thankfully been rolled back since by the courts and by the Biden administration. But you mentioned that there's a lot more history than even just what comes from the Trump era, and even a lot farther back than even Ronald Reagan's racist myth of the welfare queen.
So dig into
and
it.
in fact, a recent report from the Center for the Study of Social Policy is actually incredibly valuable on this. And we did a whole episode of Off Kilter, the podcast and radio show that I host about poverty, inequality, and everything they intersect with. We did a whole episode last week on this, the racist roots of work requirements. It was something of an open letter to Joe Manchin. The Center for the Study of Social Policy, who is featured in that episode, has documented in painstaking depth that work requirements have a long and assorted history in U.S. public policy. And in fact, they date all the way back to slavery. So let's be very clear here. Requiring people to work in exchange for basic supports it's founded on the idea that people don't want to work, and that therefore they need to be coerced to work by public policy. And this is an idea that is rooted in a very old racist myth that was originally developed by white enslavers to justify the forced labor of black people from Africa who were enslaved for white people to profit from. And so that's the original origins of work requirements in their most literal sense. But since the formal end of slavery, work requirements have consistently been used to coerce and to exploit and to devalue black people's labor. And that's, of course, despite the fact that black people have always participated in the U.S. labor force at high rates, and in many cases, especially in the case of black women, at higher rates than their white counterparts. But that's the long view history of this policy that we're talking about right now, and that we're unfortunately in the middle of yet another debate around. And while this moment is an opportunity to try to turn the page on that history, unfortunately, that senator from West Virginia is not interested in turning that page, it seems.
It's pretty mind-boggling. So the key to the whole thing, it's kind of like Hobbes versus Rousseau. You know, it's like are we intrinsically good people or intrinsically evil people? Are we intrinsically people who like to have work and a mission and something to do all day, or are we people who just like to sit around on the couch and drink Jim Beam and watch soap operas and eat bonbons or something? Is there any research on what percentage of people actually don't want to work? I mean, the lazy few. I'm guessing it's probably between 1% and 3% of the population that are just like miswired somehow or traumatized or whatever. You know, setting aside people who are physically disabled, things like that.
Well, in fact, actually looking at the child tax credit in particular, which is where Joe Manchin is targeting his proposal, right? He's saying he wants to add these work reporting requirements to the child tax credit, a program that's about ensuring that all children have what it takes to thrive. It's not a program for forced labor for parents, but that's what he wants to turn it into. If you actually look at the child tax credit specifically, what you see is that, according to the Treasury Department, 97% of families benefiting from the child tax credit in its current and expanded form are working either in some kind of job outside the home or in self-employment. And so 97%, right? That's where we are. And yet Joe Manchin's quote here, right, when he was initially saying that this was going to be his demand as a condition for allowing kids to continue to benefit from this incredibly important and successful policy, he said on CBS, on one of the Sunday shows, "Don't you think," I'm quoting here, "don't you think if we're going to help the children that people should make some effort?" And it's sort of mind-boggling when you think about that kind of a comment, given that it fundamentally devalues the unpaid work that parents do in raising and caring for their children. And this was a point that Senator Sherrod Brown, a longtime champion for the child tax credit, made when he was asked what he thought of Manchin's comments. Sherrod Brown said, "Well, I think raising children is work." And, the man's got a point.
Yeah, he absolutely does. And a good one, and one that needs to be echoed over and over and over again. Rebecca Vallas, Senior Fellow with the Century Foundation, tcf.org is the website. Twitter handle, Rebecca Vallas, Vallas, Rebecca Vallas. Rebecca, thanks so much for dropping by. Oh, and the podcast, Off Kilter Show and Podcast, available wherever fine podcasts are available, I'm assuming, Rebecca?
They are. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get your pods, and you can find lots more about this on last week's show.
TomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Thank you very much, Rebecca Vallas. We'll be right back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. And welcome back. Jake in Elizabeth, Pennsylvania. Hey, Jake, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I'm a little older than you by about 8 years, and I was going to tell you that since you started your rant this morning about what JFK had to say about calling a peaceful revolution is going to absolutely guarantee a violent revolution, which maybe it's coming, but who knows? Time will tell. At any rate, it's Tom, are you still there?
Yeah, I am. I'm listening.
Okay, great. In 1963, when they assassinated JFK, I personally believe, but you have investigated a lot more than I'll ever be able to. I personally believe the military industrialists assassinated him because they needed the money for keeping their gun producers afloat. Any rate, it seems to me that this has turned from that date, this has turned from the American dream into the American nightmare. For instance, I've got a couple of boys that haven't had jobs their entire lives now. And one of them is super smart. I was tested with an IQ of 120, and he's far more smarter than I am.
So is this as a result of the job prospects in Elizabeth, Pennsylvania? Are you in rural Pennsylvania, that kind of thing?
Nope.
So
no.
How did Kennedy's assassination lead to the inability of people today to get jobs? I'm missing something here, Jake.
Well, let's put it to you this way. That's when the oligarchs came out and said, we are taking control of this country back from the FDR Democratic types. And that's That was the date.
If that was the case, though, LBJ never...
They announced it in spades on that date.
Yeah, well, respectfully, I disagree. I think it was the mafia who killed Kennedy. But regardless of who killed Kennedy, he was followed by Lyndon Johnson, who put into place, massive, expansive programs. He put into place Medicare. He put into Medicaid. He got the Voting Rights Act passed. He got the Civil Rights Act passed. He got food stamps. He got Section 8 housing. I mean, just all kinds of stuff that the oligarchs were just clutching their pearls over, Jake. And it seems to me like the turning point. If I get it, that Kennedy's assassination was a turning point of types, and I would say that his and Bobby's and Martin Luther King's assassination, all within this 5-year period, was really the point at which the progressive movement got hit in the face really hard. But 1980 was the real turning point when Reagan got elected, don't you think? That was when policy actually changed.
Yeah, but they had been working on it since the 1930s whenever FDR tossed them out of there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, but the problem there was FDR didn't go nearly far enough. He didn't come out and say, in effect, you oligarchs are going to pay the rest of us.
Oh, he should have found out who was behind.
Trillions of dollars out of your morbid wealth pens. You're going to pay the rest of us.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, Jake. And he should have gone after the people who tried to kidnap and assassinate him, and he didn't. And I'm afraid we're about to make that mistake again. We'll be right back. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. So we have a new video up over at ThomHartmann.com. It's about 18 U.S. Code 2384, which is a law that was published back in put on the books on June 25th, 1948. It was updated in 1956. And it's very, very straightforward. It says, if 2 or more persons in any state or territory or in any place subject to the jurisdiction of the United States conspire to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or to levy war against them, or to oppose by force the authority thereof, or by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States, or by force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States, they shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for not more than 20 years or both. Tell me that doesn't perfectly describe what happened on January 6th. Seditious conspiracy. The video's at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. June in British Columbia, Canada. Hey, June, thanks for listening to SiriusXM. What's up?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Well, I just called because of all of this mess off the coast of California, and apparently it's the port. And I just can't understand, or I wonder if I'm the only person that sees a connection to Elaine Chow's family's business, shipping, marine electronics, and all of this mess off the coast. Am I wrong? Is there a supply? It ultimately ends up being a supply chain issue.
I'm guessing that you've got, this is just a guess, June. I've not ever seen any kind of authoritative investigative reporting on this. But
New York Times.
Beg your pardon?
New York Times wrote an article about this. So there's a short article in June of 2019.
Right. I'm not talking about Elaine Chow's family. What I'm saying is I suspect that the supply chain problems that we have a couple of different factors that are driving them. Number one, you've got trucking shortages and trucker shortages, and you've got crew shortages for some of these large ships, or at least we did up until the last 6 months. And that was because people were literally dying of COVID on these ships. COVID was just running through ships and wiping out members of the crew and disabling members of the crew. And so, for a number of months, basically, you had a lull in shipping in part because of that. Now everybody's vaccinated. Number two, you had a major recession. That was the first 6 months or the probably most of 2020 actually, and people weren't buying things, and so the supply chain kind of went down, right? Because we've gone, this whole neoliberal thing that Reagan brought us, it was celebrated. I remember in the 80s and 90s, Thomas Friedman talking about how wonderful it is. Everybody's doing just in time inventory. In other words, instead of having a factory where you stored things, and then doled them out to your retail stores, you would go right from the China supplier to the Port of Long Beach to a truck that would bring it to the Walmart in West Virginia, And so the fact that those warehouses literally don't even exist any longer. Everything is continuous supply chain, and that supply chain was depressed for a year, and now there's all that pent-up demand coming back. Just like after World War II, there was a period of inflation and shortages in the late 40s and early 50s that was, again, the result of people coming back from World War II, the economy bouncing back, and a sudden surge of demand after 5 years of suppressed demand. And that demand couldn't be met by supply rapidly enough, and that produces inflation, and it produces bottlenecks. And I think that it's compounded by people in the industry that is moving things having gotten sick with COVID. But I think the principal thing is just this cycle of a depressed economy followed by a red hot economy, pushing. And then with regard to things like lumber, I mean, we replaced a deck on our house a couple of weeks ago, and the wood was like 3 times what it normally would cost. That's, that in part is because we're having natural disasters in the United States like we never had before. You had this massive cold spell in Texas that went all the way down to Texas, just 8-10 months ago, that destroyed or damaged hundreds of thousands of houses. And then you had 2 really consequential hurricanes up the East Coast that went way deep inside America, places where they typically don't, and massive flooding throughout the Midwest. All of it damaging homes and creating demand for goods that we just don't make in America anymore, thanks to Reagan and Clinton and neoliberalism. All that stuff is stuff we're importing from China. And so you've got ships that are packed with wood, that are packed with sheetrock, that are packed with, electrical. So, I mean, it's just, it's a perfect storm, in my opinion, June.
Yes, I agree.
So how does this tie into Elaine Chao's family, who owns, one of the bigger shipping companies in the world, but certainly they're not the major supplier to the United States?
No, but that's true. But it was a thought that I had, and I appreciate you explaining it that way, because I'm so on the edge anymore. I'm so on the ledge anymore that I feel super sensitive about any of this stuff. Yeah. Because we're all being directed toward conspiracy theories. Yeah. I think we need to take a deep breath. Exactly. Yeah. I need to be. Help to take a deep breath. Yeah, well, there you go. I hope I'm helping you with that. This is a natural cycle that we saw. It's almost a blow-by-blow replay of what we saw in 1946, 47, 48. I go back and look at the history of the time, and that echoed right up until the early 50s. But that was a much longer. I mean, we were in the war for multiple years. We were only in COVID for, in a bad way, an economically depressed way for around 10 months. I think, and Biden came out just about 10 minutes ago and gave a press conference or a speech where he said, we're going to do a 90-day sprint to try to fix this. And they're running the ports now 24/7 and doing things like that. So I think we're going to see this resolved. June, thank you for the call. Your concerns, I'm sure, are probably shared by many people. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to address them. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. CB Distillery, CBD for sleep and pain relief. More info is available at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. Ground News, a well-rounded perspective for news readers. More info at ground.news/Tom. Angie, for any project on your to-do list. More info at Angie.com. Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at Dinovite.com. And ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More information at expressvpn.com/Tom.
We say fight back!
Today's book in our book club is The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, by this guy, Thom Hartmann. This is from chapter 1, or from the introduction, actually. In 2016, 6% of Americans who were eligible to vote nominated Donald Trump as the GOP's presidential candidate. It was 8% for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. Trump went on to be elected president by 26% of eligible voters. The modern American oligarchs have largely stayed in power using three simple elements: explicit and overt racism, massive disinformation campaigns, and voter suppression. No ideas, no push for better schools, hospitals, airports, roads, or bridges, or reform of our health, energy, or financial systems. No promise of more and better jobs. None of these staples of past presidential campaigns can be found in pretty much any Republican advertising today. Instead, the public Republican message is all about race, or the subset of race, religion. Muslim stands in for brown Arab in GOP speak, and immigration, aka brown people from south of our border, and socialism. Meanwhile, Republican secretaries of state across the nation are vigorously purging voters from the rolls. Over 17 million, more than 10% of America's active voters, in just the 2016-2018 period, according to NBC News. After the After the 5 Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, 14 GOP-controlled states moved within a year, some within days, to restrict access to the vote, particularly for communities of color, students, and retired people. In North Carolina, for example, 158 polling places were permanently closed in the 40 counties with the most African-American voters just before the 2016 election, leading to a 16% decline in African-American early voting in that state. An MIT study found that nationwide, Hispanic voters wait 150% longer in line than white voters, and black voters can expect to wait 200% longer in line to vote. In Indiana, then Governor Mike Pence's new rigorous voter ID law caused an 11.5% drop in African-American voting. Students are suing for their right to vote, and retired people who no longer drive but care passionately about their Social Security and Medicare are being turned away at the polls by the hundreds of thousands because their driver's licenses have expired. The obvious failure of 40-plus years of Reaganomics and GOP policies to maintain a functional middle class in America has been a problem for the modern GOP. In 1974, for example, the GOP had outright control of only 7 states. The message, elect us and we'll help the rich people, just didn't generally resonate with American voters. It's the reason why, outside of the fluke elections of 46 and 52, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives outright for 3 generations, from 1933 to 1996, and controlled the Senate for most of that time. Desperate to win the presidency for the GOP in 1968, Richard Nixon went so far as to commit treason by torpedoing a peace deal with President Lyndon Johnson that President Lyndon Johnson had worked out with the North and South Vietnamese. According to Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, then president of Iran, Ronald Reagan did the same thing by cutting a deal with Iran whereby they would hold on to the U.S. embassy hostages until after the 1980 presidential election, torpedoing Jimmy Carter's chances of re-election. But in 2000, the GOP changed tactics. After Reagan was almost busted for his part in Iran-Contra, he testified that he had forgotten about details of the program more than 80 times. His growing Alzheimer's spared him an indictment. They realized that getting busted for treason wasn't worth the risk. They needed a plan B, and it was deliciously simple. If most voters don't like what you're selling, then just don't let them vote. Paul Weyrich promoted this idea back in 1980 when he was campaigning for Reagan after co-founding the Heritage Foundation. And indeed, many Republican luminaries, such as William Rehnquist, who went from serving the GOP by standing in polling places and intimidating Hispanic and Native American voters in the 1960s, to becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rose up through the ranks by participating in Republican-run voter intimidation schemes. Voter suppression became the foundational go-to tactic for the GOP in 2000. Although the GOP attacked Democratic presidential nominee Al Gore with smear and innuendo, ridiculing him for helping write the legislation that created the modern internet, for example, the main thing that got George W. Bush into the White House was voter suppression. His brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush, and Bush's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, threw somewhere between 20,000 and 90,000 African-American voters off the rolls. They were able to get the vote close enough. The 5 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court functionally awarded Bush the presidency. The BBC covered this in 2001 in 2 major investigative reports that were seen all over the world, except on any American media. By 2016, the Republican Party had fine-tuned its voter suppression and intimidation systems to the point that they ran like well-oiled machines in nearly 30 states. Between the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, for example, Ohio had purged more than 2 million voters from its rolls, the vast majority, more than 2 to 1, in heavily African-American and Hispanic counties. The 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that they could keep it up. And other states have since adopted their new tactic of caging voters. The book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, by me.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. There is a week-long action by climate and indigenous groups in Washington, D.C. 135 activists were arrested on Monday at the White House. While Monday's actions highlight indigenous-led resistance to fossil fuels and mark Indigenous Peoples Day, that was Monday, Tuesday's action is going to focus on how fossil fuels are driving the climate crisis. We will have with us in a moment John Beard Jr., the founder and chairman and CEO of the Port Arthur Community Action Network. But right now we've got his video, but we don't have his audio. Joyce is trying to call him, and so that we can carry his audio on radio. Not sure what exactly is going on there, but oh, there he is. Okay. John Beard Jr., you are on the phone.
Yes, I am, indeed, in the flesh.
Thank you kindly. So tell us about the climate change emergency. Why do we need to declare a climate change emergency, stop all new fossil fuel projects? And actually, let's start out with what's going on in Washington, D.C. this week.
Well, what's going on in Washington, D.C. is that we're having a break free from fossil fuels movement, is staging, rather, a people versus fossil fuels protest, and it's a part of that movement. Mm-hmm. And we're saying that we believe that the president must declare a climate emergency because of what's happening all over, not just this country, but around the world. The climate change, which is induced by our heavy dependence on fossil fuels and the burning thereof, is creating a problem where, from where I'm at on the Gulf Coast, we have these hurricanes and storms with torrential rains, and we have numerous climatological issues all over the country, ranging from forest fires out west to the flooding and the drenching in the Midwest and flooding and hurricanes on the East Coast. Mm-hmm. So in order to prevent greater catastrophe, we are asking the president to declare a climate emergency and to ban all the expansion of fossil fuels for export and the creation of new fossil fuel facilities, and to also take necessary measures to usher in an age of clean, green, renewable energy.
Are you finding allies in this request or demand?
Yes, we've got quite a few allies. There are people that are slowly beginning to come around and understand what's actually happening here and happening to us. And for those that aren't allies, and I've run into quite a few, my statement to them is, that are climate disbelievers and the like. Well, if you're wrong, do we have the luxury of you being wrong? Do we have the luxury of continuing to go this route? Because we're reaching a tipping point where if the Earth's temperature exceeds that 1.2 degrees, 1.5 degrees Celsius in its average overall temperature, then the effects of climate change will be irreversible. And life as we know it will be dramatically and drastically changed forever. So we want to avert that type of catastrophe and the effect it has on not just the planet, but on human life in general.
So Monday's march in Washington, D.C. To declare a climate emergency. Monday's had a heavy emphasis on indigenous people because Monday was an Indigenous Peoples Day, number one, and number two, the indigenous peoples of the planet have been yelling at us for the past 50 years at least to stop basically raping our planet. Number two, on Tuesday, it was focused on how fossil fuels are driving the climate crisis. Today is Wednesday. I understand you just came from the protest or the demonstration or march or whatever you want to call it. Tell us about today and what's going to happen through the rest of the week, John.
Well, the issue today was regarding our communities can't wait. We can't afford to wait when we're having these catastrophes and the floods and the heavy rains and the hurricanes that are driven by climate change and fossil fuel use. Our communities can't stand it. Our communities can't also stand it because the companies that locate here pollute and they create problems that make life very difficult for people. The prosperity even that they promise, they all promise to create jobs and opportunity. But people of color, and especially indigenous peoples, they don't see those opportunities and they don't get those jobs. And if they do, there are very few of them in proportion to the number of people in that given area. So as I like to say, and especially about my hometown, Port Arthur, that we are the sacrifice zone for America. We take the brunt of all of the pollution and contamination and all, so America can enjoy its fossil fueled life. But there comes a time at some point that you have to change the direction you're going. And now with this crisis, we've got to move in a different direction. So that's what today was about, telling the stories of our various communities. And tomorrow's issue will be, trying to think about it, there's so many of these issues, but tomorrow's issue will be somewhat a continuation of those stories, but to also look at the fact that we don't need to have false solutions. They're pushing hydrogen use, they're pushing other sorts of fuels, methane, and other sources of energy, but those are only false solutions. They're talking about carbon capture and sequestration. That's a false solution. You're just transferring the problem somewhere else. The problem is, if you want to reduce carbon, reduce your carbon footprint, reduce the amount of carbon you put in the atmosphere. So we're going to talk about that tomorrow, about false solutions and why they're false and why the president has no choice, rather, than to call a climate emergency, institute the right plans to take us on a different course and direction. And what I also would like to say is that we need reformative justice in communities that have been adversely affected, that people of color have been neglected and abused and mistreated by the fossil fuel companies and those that participate in that business. So we want to restore them to a proper place so that this new clean, green economy is going to be one built on fairness and equity and, I guess you'd say, justice for all.
When I asked you about allies, I'm wondering how many politicians are openly, calling for. I mean, the step that you've got Joe Biden's Build Back Better plan that has broad, support across the Democratic caucus, with the exception of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, and it would replace a lot of our fossil fuel structure with infrastructure with solar and wind and good stuff like that, and would provide incentives to move in those directions. But that is still not a, let's call an emergency and bring everything to a screeching halt kind of even conversation, much less plan. Are there any people in Congress who are saying what you're saying right now, John Beard Jr.?
There are some members that agree with us that do that. Ro Kahana in California is one that has supported that, especially in terms of the offshore drilling that's going on, the new leases that are being released. And other senators, other congressmen have indicated, rather, that they do support what we're doing. But once again, the problem is you need 50 votes. And you don't have quite enough of them if you're looking at the two senators that are opposed to it on that side. And you also look at a sizable faction of the Republicans that don't support that, because a lot of them want to continue the use of fossil fuels, because a lot of the money they get comes from these fossil fuel and related energy companies. So, you know, they don't want to necessarily bite the hand that feeds them, but what they also have to consider is how they're hurting their constituents, whether they know it or not. So we need them to assert some leadership. We need those that are in favor of it but are somewhat silent to join the fight and stand up for the people and their constituents and others, because this is really an emergency. If we don't do something and do it fast, you know, we're going to be in trouble. Let me say this. You know, years ago we hear about this, that climate change was going to be a problem. Oh, what happened? Nothing going to really start showing its ugly little head till after 2050. Well, we're seeing it dramatically. I mean, case in point, Greenland, for the first time in recorded history, had rainfall. Most of the time that rain's in the form of snow, but now Greenland's seeing rain, and a lot of its ice sheet is melting. And so that should send us an alarm and also be a cautionary note to us that if we don't stop what we're doing, we're going to reach the point of no return. And that's not going to be good for any of us.
Right. We're talking with John Beard Jr., the founder and chairman, CEO of the Port Arthur Community Action Network. PortArthurCAN.org is the website. John, the conversation that we had just a minute ago about any allies that you may have in Congress was, took place within the context entirely of the Democratic Party. Are there any Republicans at all? I realize, you know, the Koch brothers and some of the other right-wing fossil fuel billionaires have built out this huge and influential and powerful right-wing network all across the United States, and they obviously have an interest in fossil fuels. And they are the principal people who are holding up the Republican Party in so many ways. Are there any Republican allies for this, or is the entire Republican Party, gone down this totally nihilistic road of, we'll just, keep making money until everybody's dead?
From my perspective, I've seen very few of them that are willing to embrace it to the extent that we are. And when they do, if they only go halfway or part of the way, it's kind of like being half horse and half cow. You don't get any of what you need. They basically seem to be wanting a continuance of what's already in place. There are those that deny. There are those that say, well, yeah, but you're going a little too far too fast. But this is an emergency. We've got to do something, and we've got to transition to it. I mean, it's not like you're going to flick a light switch and change it, but you've got to make the move. And most of them don't seem to want to make the move. The party's still caught up in Trump and Trumpism and denialism and anti-science. And that simply just isn't good, not to reasonable thinking people.
Yeah,
but
I'm with you.
So far as I know, most of them have not signed on or come on board or even suggested how they can make this more palpable or better.
There you go.
We're at a point where it's got to happen.
John Beard Jr., he is the, and thank you very much for being with us, John. He's the founder, chairman, and CEO of the Port Arthur Community Action Network, PortArthurCAN.org. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's 17 minutes past the hour. Back with your calls and the news of the day right after this. And welcome back. I want to go back to the supply chain thing for a minute. I think it's really worth talking about. We had, June called at the end of the last hour, concerned about, why is this happening, essentially, and wondering if there was some, grand conspiracy behind it. In a way, there is a grand conspiracy behind it, and I think it's really important to highlight that. And in fact, this would probably make a great topic for an op-ed. It used to be that the way that, retail stores, chains, big chains, or manufacturing companies would work is they had warehouses for their raw materials or for their products that they were going to sell. And so, you know, manufacturing could go in fits and starts, transportation could go in fits and starts, but as long as you had a warehouse with enough stuff in it, you could always make things available to your consumers. And this innovation came along, and I remember when this happened. This was like this big story in the business news. And having been an independent businessman my entire life, small business, but nonetheless, you know, I've been reading the business news since I was in my 20s. And it was called just-in-time supply chain or just-in-time manufacturing. And the idea was that if you're making cars, for example, and normally you would have you know, you'd buy, and you need radios for the cars, and so normally you'd buy, you know, 6 months worth of radios. You'd buy, you know, 500,000 radios, and you'd put them in a warehouse, and then you'd use them, and you know, every 6 months you'd order another 500,000, and you'd be continuously replenishing your warehouse and filling things out of the warehouse into the manufacturing, into the assembly plant. But the whole idea of just-in-time manufacturing was that get rid of the warehouse. And tell the manufacturers, you know, we need, you know, 150 radios a day for the 150 cars we're going to make today, or we need, you know, 800 radios a week. And so please just bring us those radios every week, or even better, every day. So every day in the morning, we're getting the supply that we're going to need for the day. And that way we can, as a manufacturer, we can eliminate the cost of that warehouse. It was a way of increasing efficiency. Increasing efficiency was the whole thing back then. And the reason, of course, to increase efficiency was to increase shareholder profits and corporate profits. And what it did, and there were a lot of people warning about this back in the 80s when this was happening, what it did was it led to an essential fragility in our systems. And there were people warning about this, saying, hey, you know, wait a minute, just-in-time sounds great, but what happens if one supplier falls apart? What happens if there's an interruption in the supply chain? What happens if it has to do with transportation? What happens if there's a natural disaster? You know, and those questions never really got well answered. Instead, everybody continued with, oh, we're just going to do just-in-time. And yeah, you know, maybe we'll have some warehouses, like Amazon has a giant warehouse, or a bunch of them, but they're going to have small numbers of product relative to what they used to be. And this is part of this whole idea, this whole neoliberal idea that efficiency is the most important thing for business. Profits are the most important thing. Customer service, not so important. Reliability of supply, not so important. What's most important is profit. And this is a way to increase profits. And now it's biting us in the butt. We'll be right back. It's coming up on 21 minutes past the hour. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. And welcome back. 22 minutes past the hour. Picking up your calls. Norma in Gary, Indiana. Hey, Norma, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, thank you very much for taking my call. I am an essential worker myself, and I just wanted to say that many working-class Americans got an opportunity, you know, for 10 months to experience enough money to pay all their bills at the same time. And now that group of people, fairly large, has a totally different consciousness about their finances. And I honestly believe that that is affecting this concept of, hey, I'm going to leave this job and really look for something that's going to give me enough finances.
I think you're right.
I think there's a new consciousness.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it was provided for by the $300 a month and $600 a month before that payments. Is that what you're talking about?
That, yes.
The unemployment?
Yes, the stimulus monies. But ultimately, like I said, the people were able to pay all of their bills at once.
Right.
When their parents, their grandparents, maybe even their great-grandparents may not, they had gotten used to just struggling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then now they have a totally new consciousness. And I think that is what the whole economy hasn't wrapped their minds around. Yeah. Our workforce has a new consciousness.
Yeah, very, very well said. I don't disagree with you at all. And I think that that's a brilliant analysis. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because if you're right, Norma, if this is one of the major factors, and it's arguably, at least a large piece of what Richard Wolff was talking about too. If this is the case, then that means that going forward, we're going to see a different labor market in the United States. And you're probably going to see a lot more unionization, particularly if we can effectively change the laws and overturn some of these Supreme Court decisions that have made it so hard to unionize.
It would be good if we had more unionization, but as you can see, individuals are like, you know what, 725 just simply is not enough.
Yeah, I'm with you. Norma, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thanks for being an essential worker. It's great talking to you. Jeff in Gurnee, Illinois. Hey, Jeff, what's up? Jeff, you are on the air? I'm not hearing any Jeff. Okay, let's try Charles in Miami. Hey, Charles, what's on your mind today? Charles? Oh, Charles just dropped off. I have a feeling that was a coincidence. Let's try David in Trumansburg, New York. Hey, David, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what's up?
I was just wondering what you thought about Durkheim's theory, because you said earlier about the motivation of people to work or not.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what Durkheim's theory is.
It's in sociology. He posited many decades ago that every society has a certain percentage of, back then they called it deviant population, people who don't want to work or drunkards or whatever.
Right.
But he said it was a necessary part of society, that when most of society had a work ethic and wanted to work and wanted to get things and get ahead, they would look at those people who didn't have things, and it would motivate them to work. And he said it worked. It didn't matter what the society was, whether it was tribes or industrialized, and he said that was true throughout history.
It's an interesting concept, David, and I would like to posit it in the context of evolutionary psychology. I laid out a theory back in the 90s, which is now widely accepted, actually, across psychology and psychiatry, that, for example, ADHD was an adaptive thing, left over from hunting-gathering times. That there's a reason why it's in our genes. There's an argument that clinical depression, is actually a positive thing in some ways for the survival of the species, or at least was during hunter-gathering times. And you wonder, and there are people who suggest that most tribal shaman are actually schizophrenics, and maybe that may have something to do with why schizophrenia endures in our genes. That those were our holy men, the Ezekiel going up into the sky in the chariot of fire, or the people seeing that, and you wonder what evolutionary advantage that would confer. I'll have to look that up. Durkheim's theory, Durkeim.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, I'll check it out. David, thank you. That's fascinating. It makes sense. Or you could simply say, 1, 2, 3% of your population is just damaged by the way that they grew up or whatever, and they're not going to want to work. And we're just going to have to carry them. That's just the price of being part of a society. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Testing things. It's a stupid waste of energy.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann.
Today, we're reading about Thunderdome politics, an uncivil war taking back our democracy in an age of Trumpian disinformation and Thunderdome politics by Greg Sargent, the Washington Post columnist. This is from his chapter on voter suppression. It's page 37. Republicans and Democrats inhabit different political realities, as mentioned in a previous chapter. But there are certain facts about our politics that are just objectively true. One of them is this. Generally speaking, efforts to make it harder to vote are almost always pushed by Republicans. You cannot understand what is happening in American politics right now without recognizing this stark and very fundamental difference between the two major political parties. During this decade, procedural hurdles were put into place in around 20 states that in some manner or other have made it harder to vote or to register to vote, or have undone previous efforts to make voting or registering easier, or have otherwise threatened serious disenfranchisement. Most of them were the creation of Republican lawmakers and officials. The difference in the two parties' national platforms for 2016 tells the story. The GOP platform champions additional hurdles that are absurdly disproportionate to the phantom abuse it alleges, while the Democratic platform champions multiple specific ways to make it easier to vote, not harder. The most common and controversial of methods used by Republicans to suppress Democratic turnout is the requirement that would-be voters present identification at the polls. The game here tends to turn on requiring forms of ID that some groups are less likely to have, making participation harder for them. Other restrictions include techniques like cutting back on early voting and making it harder to register, both of which have, in recent years, been instituted in multiple states. Republicans who have passed laws making it harder to vote have tended to claim such measures are necessary to protect against, quote, voter fraud. We'll look at this in more detail below, but for now, note that most of the states that have passed such measures did so while under Republican control. As New York University political scientist Samuel Isikoff has memorably put it, the single predictor necessary to determine whether a state will impose voter access restrictions is whether Republicans control the ballot access process. Scholars trace the modern era of warfare over election rules to the intensely contested presidential election of 2000, in which a divided Supreme Court halted the recount in Florida, throwing the presidency to George W. Bush. The closeness and partisan acrimony of that contest, combined with the intense national focus on election rules that accompanied the court battle over it, helped persuade both parties to invest much more attention and energy on those rules. As a result, both the implementation of measures restricting the ballot and the legal battles over them have intensified in recent years. A brief glance at the surprising history of voter ID laws begins to tell the story of this tightening. In the 1970s, several states implemented voter ID measures, but all of them provided for ways that voters without the proper ID could cast a ballot. By 2000, there were 14 such laws, and they had been implemented by politicians in both parties. But by the mid-2000s, amid rising post-2000 acrimony, a handful of red states began implementing voter ID laws that the nonpartisan National Conference of State Legislatures described as, quote, strict, meaning that they make it easy to disqualify those who don't pass muster. After one of those laws in Indiana was challenged and then upheld in 2008 by the Supreme Court, an escalation began that gained momentum in the Obama era. From 2010 onward, the adoption of voter ID laws in general, and of strict ones in particular, accelerated. Though a handful were blocked in the courts, as of this writing, a total of 34 states have voter ID laws in effect, 24 that are deemed non-strict and 10 that are deemed strict. The strict ones are in red states or in swing states where they were implemented by Republicans. The story is very similar if you evaluate the state's voting rules in a broader way, by including not just voter ID measures, but also cutbacks to early voting and restrictions on registration. Here the trend is just as pronounced. After the 2010 elections, the Brennan Center for Justice documented a sharp rise in efforts to pass such measures in the state legislatures across the country. Not all these efforts bore fruit, but many did. By the time voting took place in Election Day 2016, some 14 states had these new restrictions in place for the first time in a presidential election. Now, as of this writing, by the Brennan Center's count, some 20 states have successfully implemented either strict voting ID requirements or cutbacks to early voting or restrictions on registration or other measures with meaningful disenfranchising effects. If you're a liberal who's frustrated by the seemingly unbreakable Republican dominance of national politics, not to mention GOP control of most state governments across the country, then the chances are that these restrictions figure heavily into your explanation of this GOP supremacy. Indeed, social media has been absolutely saturated in recent years with variations of the lament that Republican political dominance is largely maintained through a combination of nefarious and undemocratic tactics, such as ballot restrictions that keep constituencies unfriendly to the GOP from voting, and extreme gerrymanders that have, in effect, built a fortress around the GOP's majority in the House of Representatives. Democrats frequently invoke the GOP's use of these tactics, often justifiably.
Automation machines had a hiccup, so apologies for the rapid transition, as it were, but anyhow, picking up your phone calls. Phil in Skull Valley, Arizona. Phil, it says you disagree with me about something here. What's the problem, or what's the issue?
The issue is the assertion that solar and wind are going to replace fossil fuels and power anything near what we have as our global economy at this point. They just, first of all, they don't, per mass comparison, solar or lithium batteries compared to the same mass of a lithium battery compared to the diesel fuel is about 1/46th of the power. The transition would require massive industrialization or even reindustrialization.
New jobs?
I just don't see. Go ahead.
New jobs?
Sorry?
The transition would require lots and lots of new jobs? Is that what you're saying?
Lots and lots.
So, Phil, how long did it take us to transition from horses to cars?
Not that long, but it was a much different.
It was about a 30-year period. It was from the 1890s to around the 1920s. And by the 1920s, we were almost entirely cars, and most cities had banned horses from their streets. In the 1890s, it just started. There were over 100 companies making cars in the United States at the beginning of the 1920s.
What was the global population then?
Well, that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to run down. But my point is that when you make technological changes, when you make technological transitions that have to do with your energy supplies, we used to use horsepower, literally. We used to feed horses oats. We'd grow oats, which was sunlight. We'd gather sun as the form of oats, feed it to horses, and then the horses would haul us around the town. And then we transitioned to using this ancient, highly concentrated, as you point out, sunlight, that from oil, which was also plants captured sunlight only hundreds of millions of years ago. But the fact of the matter is that it took about a generation to make that transition. And I don't think that anybody can make the argument that because this transition can't happen tomorrow morning, that it's not a good idea to begin making it.
No, I'm not arguing that it won't happen fast enough. I'm arguing that the impacts of we need to mine so much lithium, put up so many windmills.
You're assuming, hang on just a second, Phil, you're assuming that the only way to store electricity is with lithium. There's a company here in Portland that just went public this week that is selling iron-based batteries for home storage. Big batteries to store power in your home. And they use no lithium at all. They use iron, which is the most abundant element in the earth. The core is made of iron.
Sure, that's more mining. That's even more iron.
But there's plenty of iron all over the place. And yeah, it may be over a period of time. I'm not arguing that there's no transition necessary or that the transition isn't going to be difficult. In my book, The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, which is all about this topic, there's a whole chapter about how, you're going to have to use fossil fuels to make those solar panels and those windmills that are going to get us to the point where we've got enough critical mass of green energy that with electricity, you can heat a blast furnace to make more steel. It's going to take some time, but it seems to me that the only way we're going to get there was massive government subsidies for the transition from horse-drawn carriages to cars between the 1880s and the 1920s. Massive. We built roads that were specifically designed for cars. We built gas stations. We subsidized the fuel industry. It was absolutely massive transition, and it was made first in our cities all across the United States. It's a fascinating era to look back at, and it was covered really well in a biography I read of John D. Rockefeller about 25 years ago. I think Robert Browning. No, it couldn't have been. Anyway, I don't recall who wrote it, but but it was this detailed. And that's what Joe Biden is proposing to do right now with the Build Back Better plan, or at least in small part. And that's what China is doing very aggressively. They're leading the world in electricity, solar, wind, and moving away from these fossil fuels. We got to do it, Phil. We got to do it.
Well, and China is also leading. I don't know if they're leading the world, but their solar panel facilities and their mining facilities are just ravaging their countryside.
To some extent, yeah, as is pretty much everything else. They're concrete making, and they're growing like crazy. Yes, that happens, and I'm not defending that. What I'm saying is that any kind of transition like this is disruptive and can be an opportunity, and I think we should be looking at it as an opportunity. Phil, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. James in Seattle. Hey, James, what's on your mind?
Hi, I just wanted to suggest that the post office give a little class to certify people to become commissioned temporary postal workers so that they can carry a letter and that they can register people with this class and get a certification. Since they're a federal employee, they can't be bothered by state laws and whatnot.
So what am I missing here? What problem are you trying to solve by doing this, James?
Well, there's a state, you just got done talking about state laws in Montana that make it difficult for people to register to vote.
Oh, right. Yeah, Montana, just for people who might just now be tuning in, Montana, the legislature passed what's called Senate Bill 319. It was signed by the governor. It's now the law. And it bars student groups or any organization from enacting, quote, voter identification efforts, voter registration drives, signature collection efforts, ballot collection efforts, or voter turnout efforts for federal, state, local, or even school elections inside a public campus-operated facility. And it's basically an attempt to prevent, college students from voting and from organizing people to vote and encouraging people to vote, because they know that those, college students are by and large voting Democratic instead of Republican.
Yes, and
so you're saying that postal workers should be the ones who are going around registering people to vote? Is that the essence of what you're saying?
Well, they could, but by giving them this class that certifies them to register people to vote and to pick up ballots.
All right.
And go down up and down the line and give people a piece of pizza and a bottle of water. And I'd have the I Care Tax billionaire pay for all this at a 5-hour nut and $100 an hour. So each and every single one of those is $500, whether it takes 15 seconds or 15 minutes or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know about the $100 an hour, but I get what you're saying, and I don't think it's a bad idea. I think empowering postal workers to register. Now, keep in mind, probably 90% of postal workers don't have the kind of person-to-person interaction that they had back, when I was a little kid, and my mom used to go to the door when she saw the mailman coming, and he would hand her the mail, and she'd say, "Hi, Fred, how's the day going?" That just doesn't happen anymore. By and large, they're just popping things into boxes, and increasingly entire neighborhoods are consolidated into boxes.
Yeah, but I'd have students or somebody do this and take this class that certifies them to do it as a temporary commissioned employee.
By making them a federal employee, they are, in your mind, exempt from state laws. I don't know to what extent that's true, but if it is, that's a fascinating thought. It's an absolutely fascinating thought. James, thanks a lot for that. Bill in Clifton, New Jersey. Hey, Bill, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I'm sorry, I'm distracted. Every time they call out the figures of people who have died, I figure out how much taller the Vietnam Memorial would be, and we're up to 130 feet,
wow.
Which is, I think, 14 stories. Yeah, starting at 10 feet. Anyway, just a way to look at it, I guess. Anyway, anyone who thinks that Medicare is free, it definitely isn't. And, I joined Medicare 3 years ago, and I've had nothing but problem with the insurance that you have to hire to fill in the gaps, especially my pharmaceutical insurance that people may not know about. If you, like most seniors, have to have pharmaceuticals, don't pay for it. So you have to get insurance to pay for your pharmaceuticals.
Right.
And they do, and like with every drug that's under an insurance, they call the doctor or they send a letter to the doctor for pre-authorization, meaning, are you sure this person still should be treated with this drug?
Right. No, I'm familiar with the problem, Bill. Did you call with a solution, or did you just want to complain about it?
Oh, no. I'm sorry. The solution would be to not have to pay for it.
Yeah.
The thing is, though...
Yeah, let's fix Medicare. I'm with you.
But the drug, I'm sorry.
Well, you know, if Medicare could negotiate drug prices, and if Medicare, you know, when George W. Bush rolled out the whole, we're going to give you free drugs, it turns out it wasn't free drugs, and there was the whole donut hole and all this other stuff. You know, and then that got a million holes drilled in it. So I'm with you. This is a real problem that needs to be fixed. Thank you for the call. Kim in Tallahassee, Florida. Hey, Kim, what's up?
Hi. Yeah, Tom, I think one of the problems with our current legislative system or the Congress is that they are totally out of touch with the common man, like you and me. They have PACs, political PACs in their pocket. They pander to whoever's paying them the most money, the drug makers, the battery makers. But they have totally forgot about the mom and pop in their neighborhoods who actually go out and really vote for them. And this is where the problem is falling apart. And it's aggravating because people want to see Congress do something, and they're not doing nothing but just sitting there fighting amongst each other, talking about two of our Democratic senators are holding up something that 48 other senators want to happen, and probably 80%.
But you know what's driving all that, Kim,
is population wants to happen.
Yeah, but what's driving that is the Supreme Court having said in Citizens United in 2010 that if an industry wants to pour money down the throat of a politician in unlimited quantities and make sure that that politician is set for life, that's not considered bribery. That's not considered political corruption. That's called free speech. I mean, you know, we need to repeal Citizens United.
Definitely. That is just, and we didn't have that 50 years ago. We didn't have that 100 years ago. We didn't have that 200 years ago when the Congress set up and when our forefathers set up.
Oh, in the early days of the Republic, if you got caught, you know, dancing to the tune of a special interest, it was political death to a large extent. Now,
exactly.
You know, yeah, and it was Nixon's taking a bribe from the milk lobby and taking a bribe from ITT. They gave him a $400,000 bribe so that he would drop an antitrust violation of theirs. You know, this all got outed in '74 in the Church Committee and all the investigations, and that's what led to all these reforms in '74, '75, and '76, where we introduced campaign financing, where, you know, the federal government will pay for any kind of federal campaign. Jimmy Carter was the one and only president to run for president on entirely federal money, or not entirely, but largely on federal money, and win the White House. You know, we got that. We got the ban on dark money. We got bans on political bribery, essentially. I mean, a lot of really good stuff happened as a consequence of, you know, Congress doing that. And then what happens? In 1976, the Supreme Court blows one hole in it with the Buckley decision. In '78, they blow another hole that has to do with corporations with their Bellotti decision. And then in 2010, they tripled down on the whole thing, saying corporations are people and money is free speech, and it's all a free-for-all politically from now on. And that, you know, 5 right-wing conservatives on the Supreme Court. Kim, I got to run, but thank you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
This is why the For the People Act, which has been stalled by the filibuster, is so important, because it actually blocks dark money, and that's why it's being blocked, of course. And welcome back. Ed in Erie, Michigan. Hey, Ed, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, you brought up the jet system a little while ago, right?
Jet system. I'm not familiar with that phrase.
the just in time. The
GIT. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Just in time manufacturing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. See, I worked at the Jeep plant in Toledo when that was implemented. Okay, from '73 to 2001, and I don't remember the exact years that was implemented. Okay, but I was there in the middle of it. I was in stock. I drove a forklift, and that took a long time to get. But of course, we had room to stock stuff because there was a lot of buildings at the old plant. You know, I worked most of my time at the old plant. They built a new one in '99, but that old plant was a bunch of old buildings. It was the oldest running plant in the country at that time. You know, and
what were you making?
Jeep. Well, I started in '73. We were making the Wagoneers, the big Jeep Wagoneers and the big Jeep pickup trucks. Yeah, and the Wranglers, and then we built the Wranglers, and then in the '84 model year, we started building the Cherokees, the original Cherokees.
Right.
Okay.
That was probably right around the time that the just-in-time manufacturing became my recollection is that it happened during the Reagan presidency, but it might have been during Clinton's.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, a lot of changes then. Yeah, plus, and then Renault bought us, had us for a while. You know, somebody was always buying us all my years, my 30 years there. You know, and it was Renault, and then tried the rest of it. You know, all the times we got sold, but we always made money for who we had. You know, my dad worked there. It was Willys Overland, Kaiser, and then when I hired in, it was American Motors that just bought it a couple of years before then. And but that was, like I said, I was in stock, and we had the room to stock the stuff. Okay, but I can remember transmissions, even stuff that was close that came from Kokomo. I think Indiana. I think it was Kokomo. But when we'd get bad weather, they'd have to shut the line down because the trucks would get stuck on the turnpike. You know, because
you guys had put into place just-in-time manufacturing processes.
Right, exactly, right. And I mean, they finally got it to working better, but it's like now they're blaming it all on these chips. I bet they're having all kinds of problems with different parts.
Oh, okay? Yeah.
I bet
they absolutely are. They absolutely are. It would be fascinating to do a deep dive into the history of just-in-time manufacturing, because that's, what we're seeing right now, in my opinion, 90% of what we're seeing right now is the result of the world the United States first, and then world manufacturing economy having adopted in the 90s and the early 2000s, and maybe the 80s.
It was the Japanese. It was Japan. Okay, that's how.
Was that where it started?
The Japanese. Exactly. That's where it started. Okay. That was before the transplants came. Okay.
Right.
Because that was Reagan that wanted to let's get these factories over here. We'll build them down south where they're against unions and. You know the rest of the story.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Ed, thanks for the trip down memory lane. I appreciate it.
Yep.
And for the addition.
Thank you for being there.
Oh, my pleasure. Ed, thank you very much, and thanks for watching Free Speech TV. We'll be back. It's 51 minutes past the hour, picking up your phone calls on the other side of this break. I'll be back in 60 seconds. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. So there are actually some substantial differences between the Taliban, the Afghanistan Taliban, the group that has, that Donald Trump signed what his Secretary of State his Defense Secretary and his National Security Advisor referred to as surrender documents to back in early 2020. There's a difference between the Taliban and ISIS, or even K-ISIS, which is how they're identifying the ISIS group that has emerged in Afghanistan. The main difference is that the Taliban's ambitions are largely confined to Afghanistan. They want to be a regional force. They were the government of Afghanistan before. They want to be the government of Afghanistan again. ISIS, on the other hand, wants to reestablish the entire caliphate across the Middle East, across Northern Africa, across parts of Southern Europe. And this is going to bring these two into conflict. I've got a whole video about this over at thomhartmann.com for folks who support the program. Check it out. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you and Kathy in Independence, Oregon. Hey, Kathy, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I see on the TV all this stuff about us going to war with China about Taiwan.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, if we're going to do that, why haven't we started mobilization? Put everyone between the ages of 16 and maybe 62 or 70 in the draft. I understand they make our clothing for the Army. We need to start making that here.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of things we need to do in mobilization. Why aren't we getting ready?
I think that it's way too late. Two things. Number one, wars are not, the wars of the future, let's say, will not be fought by people on battlefields. They will be fought electronically, and they will be fought remotely with drones and bombs and things like that. But the electronic part of it is the biggest part. There's actually a whole chapter about this in the book that I've got coming out in 6 months, The Hidden History of Big Brother, about how countries, we've been attacked on multiple occasions, actually, here in the United States. Our infrastructure has been attacked. Dams shut down, bridges closed, factories blown up, basically by people getting inside their manufacturing systems, literally by several other countries. And so if we want to defend Taiwan, if we want to prevent China from physically taking over Taiwan, we have to be ready for China to say, okay, that's it. No more goods going to the United States. You think we've got supply problems now? It's going to get insane, number one. I mean, they will bring us to our knees just economically through that. Number two, they've got extraordinary hacking capability. And one of the big innovations that George W. Bush brought was, making all the security, the hardening of critical facilities like nuclear power plants. And by hardening, I'm talking about in the digital world, making them impervious to hacking and things. George W. Bush made that all optional. So we've got facilities. So we've got facilities around the country where the Chinese could simply come in and shut down a nuclear power plant, or even worse, just shut down the cooling system so that the nuclear power plant melts down and everything within 200 miles of it turns into Chernobyl. And they could do this, and we've got, 130 nuclear power plants in the United States? I mean, they could shut down our water systems, they could turn off our electricity systems, and they could do all of this in one day. I mean, just consider a concerted attack. This is how these war games that we are practicing with China, this is how they play out. They shut down our supply lines, no more ships coming to us. They're willing to take the economic hit for that, no problem. They're supplying the rest of the world. They no longer need the United States. They couldn't have done this 20 years ago. They can easily do this now. And then their hackers get into the act, and they've got a division of their military that's like our Air Force is all about jet planes. Well, they've got, and Trump said you created a space force. Well, they've got a cyber force. And an offensive cyber force. And it's not just China, by the way. Pretty much every developed country in the world is doing this. But specifically to your question, if we chose to go to war with China over Taiwan, if we chose to protect Taiwan, it's not going to be our soldiers versus their soldiers, or even probably our ships versus their ships. It's going to be that they're going to bring us to our knees in probably less than a week. And, it's a very, very troubling scenario, Kathy, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't have any easy answers for this. I'm a big fan of Taiwan. I've been there many times. It's a democracy in that part of the world. And that's where I'm at. Kathy, I got to run, but thank you for the call. I mean, this is a huge issue and with no easy answers. And to a large extent, it is the consequence, in my opinion, of the 40 years of neoliberal trade policy that built China with American consumption. Anyhow, we'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. We need to get active. So get out there, get active, tag. You're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. CB Distillery, CBD for sleep and pain relief. More info is available at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. Ground News, a well-rounded perspective for news readers. More info at ground.news/Tom. Angie, for any project on your to-do list. More info at Angie.com. Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at Dinovite.com. And ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More information at expressvpn.com/Tom.
We say fight back!